In the sealed chambers beneath the Eka temple complex at Nippur, archaeologists working for the University of Pennsylvania expedition between 1888 and 1900 discovered something that would trouble Assyriologists for generations to come. Among the thousands of cuneiform tablets catalogued from the site, a disturbing pattern emerged in fragments dating to approximately 2200 to 2100 BC. Dozens of tablets showed evidence of systematic erasure, not the typical damage from fire, water, or collapse, but deliberate obliteration of specific text sections using tools that scraped away the clay surface before the tablets were refired to preserve them in their edited state. What made these erasures particularly significant was their selective nature. Administrative records, mathematical texts, and commercial transactions remained untouched. Only tablets containing narratives about the Anunnaki showed this systematic editing, with entire passages removed and occasionally replaced with alternative text that contradicted earlier portions of the same document. Chemical analysis conducted in 1987 by researchers at the Oriental Institute revealed that the erasure tools left microscopic copper traces distinct from the bronze styluses used for original inscription, suggesting the editing occurred during a later period using different metallurgical techniques. More significantly, spectroscopic examination of the clay composition showed that the tablets had been subjected to secondary firing at temperatures exceeding those typically used in ancient Mesopotamian tablet production, indicating that whoever performed these erasures possessed advanced knowledge of ceramic preservation techniques. The pattern of erasures points to a coordinated effort rather than random censorship. Tablets from different fine contexts across the Nippur temple precinct show identical editing techniques and target the same categories of content, specifically passages describing conflicts between different Anunnaki factions, territorial disputes among divine administrators, and references to what the texts term the Great Division that preceded the establishment of human kingship. The scope of this investigation will examine the archaeological evidence for systematic text modification, analyze the surviving fragments that escaped erasure, reconstruct the narrative that scribes were compelled to conceal, and explore the implications of an Anunnaki civil conflict that ancient authorities deemed too dangerous for human knowledge. The cuneiform tablets recovered from the scribble quarter of Nippur's temple complex reveal technological sophistication in their modification that exceeds normal ancient editorial practices. Tablet N 3945, catalogued in the University Museum's collection, demonstrates the precision of these erasures through microscopic examination that reveals 3 distinct layers of clay treatment. The original inscription, partially visible through advanced imaging techniques, was methodically scraped away using metal tools that left parallel groove patterns consistent across multiple tablets. The scraped surface was then smoothed with abrasive compounds containing fine quartz particles before new text was inscribed, and the entire tablet was refired at temperatures that modern ceramic analysis places at approximately 950 degrees Celsius, significantly higher than the 600 to 700 degrees typically used for initial tablet firing. The discovery of these modified tablets occurred during systematic excavations conducted by the University of Pennsylvania between 1888 and 1900, led by John Punnett Peters and later Hermann Hilprecht. The expedition recovered over 30,000 tablet fragments from various contexts within the temple precinct, with approximately 300 showing clear evidence of intentional modification. The concentration of modified tablets in specific archive rooms, particularly those associated with the Enlil Temple's library, suggests that the erasure campaign targeted centralized repositories of religious texts rather than attempting to locate and modify every copy in circulation throughout Mesopotamia. Modern analysis techniques have revealed the extraordinary care taken in these modifications. Confocal microscopy performed by researchers at the British Museum in 2006 demonstrated that the erasure process removed clay to depths of 0.5 to 1.2 millimeters. penetrating well below the surface inscriptions without compromising the structural integrity of the tablets. The consistency of erasure depth across multiple tablets indicates the use of calibrated tools and standardized procedures rather than crude scraping. The abrasive compounds applied after initial erasure contained quartz particles measuring between 50 and 100 micrometers in diameter, mixed with water and possibly organic binding agents that have since decomposed, creating smooth surfaces that could receive new inscriptions without visible irregularities. The refiring process represents perhaps the most technically challenging aspect of the modification procedure. Ceramic engineering analysis conducted by Material Science Department at the University of Chicago demonstrated that achieving 950 degrees Celsius temperatures required specialized kiln construction and fuel management far exceeding normal tablet production requirements. At these elevated temperatures, the clay undergoes additional vitrification that increases hardness and water resistance, while also making the modifications nearly permanent. Any attempt to remove the overlying text would likely destroy the entire tablet, effectively making the erasures irreversible through ancient techniques. The knowledge required to successfully refire tablets at these elevated temperatures without causing warping, cracking, or complete destruction indicates that the erasure campaign employed master ceramicists who understood advanced principles of clay chemistry and thermodynamics. Thermoluminescence dating of the modified tablets confirms the timing of the refiring events. Samples taken from erased and reinscribed portions of tablet N 3945 and 7 other modified tablets from the Nippur collection show thermoluminescence ages corresponding to approximately 2200 BC, roughly 200 years after the original inscriptions were created during the Third Dynasty of Ur. This chronological gap between original composition and systematic modification points to a deliberate historical moment when authorities decided that certain narratives about the Anunnaki required elimination from the historical record. The selection of tablets for modification appears to have followed specific criteria, as tablets containing purely administrative content from the same archive room show no evidence of thermal treatment beyond their initial firing. Chemical composition analysis of the tool marks embedded in erased tablets provides crucial chronological information about when these modifications occurred. Scanning electron microscopy, conducted by the British Museum's Conservation Laboratory, identified copper alloy traces in the erasure grooves that match metallurgical signatures from the Akkadian period, specifically the reign of Naram-Sin around 2250 BC. This dating corresponds precisely with historical records describing Naram-Sin's consolidation of religious authority and his controversial claim to divine status, suggesting the erasure campaign was implemented under his direct orders. The copper content ratios in these tool marks differ substantially from the bronze styluses used during the original Third Dynasty of Ur period, when the tablets were first inscribed, confirming that the editorial work occurred decades or centuries after initial composition. The metallurgical analysis employed energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy to determine the precise elemental composition of metallic traces left in the erasure grooves. The copper alloys used in the erasure tools contained approximately 85 to 90% copper, with significant tin content of 8 to 12%, along with trace amounts of arsenic, lead, and nickel that serve as metallurgical fingerprints indicating specific ore sources and smelting techniques. These composition ratios match exactly with bronze artifacts recovered from Akkadian period contexts at sites including Girsu, Umma, and Akkad itself, providing independent confirmation of the erasure campaign's timing. The identification of Naram-Sin's reign as the probable period of the erasure campaign gains additional support from historical inscriptions describing his religious reforms and consolidation of divine authority. Naram-Sin was the first Mesopotamian ruler to explicitly claim divine status during his lifetime. Adding the divine determinative sign before his name in royal inscriptions and constructing temples dedicated to his own worship His assumption of divine prerogatives created theological tensions with traditional Sumerian religion, which maintained clear distinctions between human kings and the Anunnaki gods who appointed them. Narratives describing conflicts among the Anunnaki themselves would have undermined Naram-Sin's theological innovations by demonstrating that even divine authority was contested and divisible, rather than absolute and unified under his claimed divine kingship. Royal inscriptions from Naram-Sin's reign describe his military campaigns as divinely ordained missions to suppress rebellion and establish universal order under his rule. The inscription on the victory stele of Naram-Sin, discovered at Susa but originally erected at Sippar, describes how the king defeated rebellious regions with divine support and established peace throughout the lands. The language of these inscriptions emphasizes unity, order, and the suppression of division, themes that align perfectly with the theological objectives of erasing narratives about divine conflicts and territorial disputes among the Anunnaki. The ideological program reflected in Naram-Sin's public monuments found its practical implementation in the systematic modification of religious texts that preserved alternative narratives of divine governance. The technical sophistication required for the erasure campaign necessitated the establishment of specialized workshops equipped with advanced metallurgical and ceramic facilities. Archaeological evidence from the Akkadian period administrative centre at Tel Brak in northeastern Syria reveals workshop complexes that processed metals and ceramics on scales exceeding normal craft production. These facilities, directly associated with Akkadian imperial administration, could have served as training centres or production sites for the specialists who carried out the tablet modification campaign. The coordination required to identify objectionable texts across multiple archive locations, transport tablets to modification workshops, and return corrected versions to their original repositories demonstrates a level of administrative sophistication that matches known Akkadian imperial capabilities. Analysis of partially erased tablets reveals systematic targeting of specific narrative categories while leaving other content untouched. Administrative records detailing temple offerings, mathematical exercises for scribble training, and commercial contracts show no evidence of modification, but tablets containing mythological narratives about Anunnaki activities display consistent erasure patterns. Tablet CBS 10,673, which preserves the Sumerian king list, shows selective removal of passages describing the pre-flood period when kingship descended from heaven, with particular attention to sections detailing conflicts among the divine council members who governed antediluvian cities. The precision of these content-specific erasures indicates that scribes worked from detailed instructions, identifying objectionable passages rather than performing general censorship. The selectivity of the erasure campaign reveals sophisticated understanding of textual content and its ideological implications. Scribes responsible for identifying problematic passages needed comprehensive knowledge of Sumerian literature and the ability to recognize narratives that contradicted the unified divine authority model promoted by Akkadian imperial theology. The training required for this level of textual analysis suggests that senior temple scribes, who possessed the deepest knowledge of traditional literature, were either coerced into participating in the erasure campaign, or that a new generation of scribes loyal to Akkadian religious reforms was specifically trained for this purpose. The Sumerian king list preserved on tablet CBS 10,673 provides crucial evidence of the erasure patterns. This document, fundamental to Mesopotamian historical consciousness, lists the kings who ruled before and after the Great Flood, attributing impossibly long reigns to antediluvian rulers. The original version of this text, reconstructed from unerased copies found at other sites, contained extensive passages describing how different Anunnaki council members governed specific antediluvian cities and competed for influence over human populations. The Nippur version shows systematic removal of these passages, particularly those describing tensions between Enlil's faction based at Nippur and Enki's southern alliance centered at Eridu. The edited version presents a simplified narrative of unified divine kingship descending from heaven without acknowledging the complex political dynamics among divine administrators. Mathematical and administrative texts from the same archive contexts show no evidence of modification, confirming that the erasure campaign targeted specific content categories rather than implementing wholesale destruction of archival materials. Tablet HS-229 from the Hilprecht collection contains advanced mathematical problems used in scribal training, including calculations of areas, volumes, and astronomical predictions. Despite being stored in the same archive room as modified mythological texts, this mathematical tablet shows no evidence of secondary firing or surface modification. Similarly, administrative records documenting temple grain distributions, livestock inventories, and labour allocations remained untouched, even when stored adjacent to tablets that underwent extensive modification. This selective approach indicates that authorities recognize the practical value of administrative and technical texts, while viewing mythological narratives about divine conflicts as ideologically dangerous. The consistency of erasure patterns across multiple tablets demonstrates that scribes worked from standardized guidelines, rather than making individual decisions about problematic content. Comparison of erasure locations on different copies of the same texts reveals that identical passages were removed from each version, with modifications occurring at precisely the same points in the narrative. This standardization required the creation of master lists identifying specific passages for removal, suggesting a centralized planning process that preceded the actual modification work. The bureaucratic infrastructure necessary to create these guidelines, distribute them to multiple workshop locations, and verify compliance with modification standards reflects the administrative capabilities of the Akkadian imperial system at its height. Despite the systematic erasure campaign, numerous tablet fragments preserved in secondary contexts escaped modification and retain original text describing conflicts among Anunnaki administrators. Tablet HS-1538 from the Hilprecht collection at Jena University preserves a narrative describing territorial disputes between Enlil and Enki over control of the Euphrates River system and its associated cities. The text describes how Enlil claimed authority over the entire Mesopotamian plain, based on his designation as Lord of the Command, while Enki asserted independent jurisdiction over the southern marshlands and the city of Eridu based on his earlier arrival and establishment of the first settlement. The dispute escalated to include accusations of boundary violations, unauthorized establishment of cult centers, and interference with human populations under rival jurisdiction. The survival of Tablet HS-1538 resulted from its deposition in a secondary refuse context, where it was discarded after breaking, placing it outside the systematic archive locations targeted by the erasure campaign. Archaeological analysis of its find context indicates it was thrown into a waste pit used for disposing of broken or damaged tablets, sometime during the late 3rd dynasty of Ur, decades before the Akkadian erasure campaign began. The tablet's broken condition, missing approximately 40% of its original surface, ironically contributed to its preservation of suppressed content by making it appear worthless for retrieval and modification. The narrative preserved on Tablet HS-1538 provides unprecedented detail about the nature of Anunnaki territorial conflicts. The text describes a formal council meeting where Enlil and Enki presented competing claims before an assembly of divine administrators. Enlil's argument rested on his designation by the supreme god Anu as Lord of the Command, a title that supposedly granted him executive authority over all earthly operations. He argued that Enki's independent establishment of settlements in the southern marshlands violated proper hierarchical procedures and created dangerous precedents for fragmented authority. The text quotes Enlil as stating that _quote _4_ and warning that divided authority among the Anunnaki would lead to chaos in human governance. Enki's counter-argument, preserved in fragmentary form, asserted priority based on chronological precedence and functional specialization. The text indicates that Enki established Eridu as the first permanent settlement on Earth, creating infrastructure and developing the marshlands before Enlil's arrival from the celestial realm. Enki argued that his technical expertise in water management, agriculture, and human genetic development gave him natural authority over the southern regions where these specializations were most crucial. The narrative describes Enki challenging Enlil's claim to universal authority by questioning whether administrative titles granted in the celestial realm automatically transferred to earthly contexts with different technical requirements and environmental conditions. The territorial dispute extended beyond abstract claims of authority to include specific accusations of boundary violations and interference. The text describes how Enlil accused Enki of establishing cult centers in cities that properly belonged under Nippur's jurisdiction, specifically mentioning Uruk and Ur as contested territories. Enki countered with accusations that Enlil's administrators had interfered with water management systems in the southern marshlands, disrupting irrigation projects and causing agricultural failures that endangered human populations under Enki's protection. These concrete disputes over water rights, city jurisdictions and human population management indicate that the conflict involved practical governance issues rather than purely symbolic or mythological elements. The escalation of the dispute receives detailed treatment in the preserved portions of the narrative. The text describes how both Enlil and Enki began fortifying their primary centers and recruiting support among other Anunnaki administrators. Ninurta, Enlil's warrior son, reportedly led military expeditions to assert his father's territorial claims, while Enki's sons Marduk and Ningishzida organized southern defenses. The narrative describes these military activities using terminology that suggests actual physical conflicts rather than purely metaphorical struggles, including references to weapons that thunder, fortifications of gleaming metal, and battles that shook the foundations of the earth. The resolution of the dispute, partially preserved in the tablet's concluding sections, involved formal territorial divisions and the establishment of boundary protocols that would prevent future conflicts. The text indicates that a compromise was reached where Enlil retained nominal supremacy as _8_ while Enki received recognized autonomous authority over the southern marshlands and specific technical domains, including water management and human genetic development. The agreement established formal boundaries between northern and southern jurisdictions and created protocols for resolving disputes through divine council deliberations rather than military confrontation. This resolution created the institutional framework that governed Anunnaki administration of Mesopotamia during the antediluvian and early post-flood periods. Temple administrative texts from Lagash and Girsu that focus on economic matters rather than mythology inadvertently preserve references to _9_ that provide context for understanding the broader conflict. Tablet BM 103366 from the British Museum collection contains a temple inventory dating to approximately 2400 BC that lists offerings designated for _10_ and mentions tribute payments intended _11_ these administrative references, which survived erasure because they appeared in economic rather than mythological contexts, confirm that Sumerian religious authorities acknowledged a historical period of divine conflict that required formal resolution and ongoing diplomatic maintenance. The survival of these administrative references demonstrates an important limitation of the erasure campaign's scope. While authorities systematically targeted mythological narratives that explicitly describe divine conflicts, they appear to have overlooked or tolerated indirect references embedded within economic and administrative documents. This oversight may have resulted from the practical impossibility of reviewing and modifying the vast quantities of administrative tablets generated by temple bureaucracies, or it may reflect a calculation that cryptic references in economic contexts pose less ideological danger than explicit narratives accessible to educated populations. Tablet BM103366 originates from the temple complex at Girsu, the religious centre of the Lagash city-state, and was discovered during French excavations conducted by Ernest de Sarzec between 1877 and 1900. The tablet's administrative function as a temple inventory ensured its preservation in economic archive contexts that were not systematically targeted for modification. The document lists various categories of offerings brought to the temple, including grain, livestock, precious metals, and manufactured goods, specifying their quantities and intended purposes. Among these routine entries appears the notation regarding offerings for, quote, 12 a term, that appears nowhere in surviving mythological texts, but clearly refers to ongoing diplomatic activities related to resolving divine conflicts. The reference to tribute payments underscore quote underscore 13 underscore provides crucial confirmation that territorial divisions among Anunnaki administrators were not merely mythological constructs but represented actual institutional arrangements that required ongoing resource allocations and diplomatic maintenance. The economic burden of maintaining this peace appears in the substantial quantities of tribute listed in the tablet: 3,600 litres of barley, 120 sheep, 15 cattle, and significant quantities of silver and copper. These resources, extracted from human agricultural and craft production, supported diplomatic activities that prevented renewal of divine conflicts that had been formally resolved through territorial divisions. Additional administrative texts from Lagash and neighbouring city-states contain similar indirect references to the Great Division and its consequences for human populations. Tablet DP633 from the Louvre's collection, also from Girsu, records labour obligations for maintaining the boundary markers of the divine estates, suggesting that formal territorial boundaries between different divine jurisdictions required physical demarcation and regular maintenance. Another text, AO3101 from the same archive, mentions offerings designated for the Feast of the Borders, apparently an annual ceremony that reaffirmed the territorial agreements and prevented encroachment. The consistency of these administrative references across multiple archive contexts confirms that the Great Division represented a fundamental organizational principle of Sumerian religious and political life, rather than an isolated mythological event. The motivation for the erasure campaign becomes clearer when examined in the context of Mesopotamian political theology and royal legitimacy claims. Sumerian and Akkadian kings derived their authority from divine appointment, and presented themselves as intermediaries between the Anunnaki and human populations. Narratives describing conflicts, territorial disputes, and power struggles among the gods undermined this legitimacy by demonstrating that divine authority was contested rather than absolute. Naram-Sin's assumption of divine titles and his construction of temples dedicated to his own worship created particular theological problems if public texts acknowledged that even the gods engaged in civil conflicts and territorial disputes. The erasure campaign thus served immediate political purposes by eliminating textual evidence that divine authority could be challenged or divided. The theological foundation of Mesopotamian kingship rested on the concept that human rulers received their authority through direct appointment by the Anunnaki Council, with legitimacy flowing downward from the celestial realm through the divine hierarchy to earthly administrators. Royal inscriptions consistently employed the formula, quote, 16 or, quote, 17 specific rulers, establishing divine choice as the fundamental source of political authority. This theological model required that divine authority itself appear unified, absolute, and unchallengeable. Any suggestion that the gods themselves engaged in contested elections, territorial disputes, or civil conflicts introduced dangerous ambiguity into the legitimacy claims of human rulers who derived their authority from supposedly unified divine appointment. The problem became particularly acute during Naram-Sin's reign, when the king adopted unprecedented divine pretensions that fundamentally altered the traditional relationship between human rulers and the Anunnaki. Prior Mesopotamian kings had claimed divine appointment and support, but Naram-Sin was the first to explicitly declare himself divine during his lifetime, adding the divine determinative sign before his name in royal inscriptions and commissioning temples where he received worship as a living god. The Victory Stele of Naram-Sin, now housed in the Louvre, depicts the king wearing the horned crown traditionally reserved for deities, standing larger than other figures in a composition that equates his military victories with divine cosmic ordering activities. This theological innovation created immediate problems regarding Naram-Sin's relationship to the traditional Anunnaki hierarchy. If the king himself was divine, did he occupy a subordinate position within the existing divine council, or did his divinity place him on equal footing with the established gods? The logical contradictions inherent in this theological position became untenable if public texts acknowledged that the Anunnaki themselves engaged in power struggles and territorial conflicts. A divine king claiming absolute authority could not easily justify his position if sacred texts described how even the original divine administrators fought civil wars over contested jurisdictions and competed for supremacy over different regions and human populations. Contemporary royal inscriptions from Naram-Sin's reign reveal the king's attempts to position himself within divine cosmology while maintaining claims to absolute earthly authority. The inscription on the foundation tablet from the Akkadian temple at Nippur describes how Naram-Sin, quote 18, and how, quote 19, acknowledged his divine kingship. The text carefully balances claims of divinity with deference to Enlil's supreme authority, suggesting that Naram-Sin's theologians struggled to articulate a coherent position that elevated the king to divine status without directly challenging the traditional divine hierarchy. The erasure campaign against narratives of Anunnaki conflicts served this theological agenda by eliminating textual evidence that divine authority could be contested, or that multiple divine powers could claim legitimate but competing jurisdictions. The political urgency of the erasure campaign becomes evident when examining the rebellions that plagued Naram-Sin's reign despite his military successes. The Great Revolt, documented in the so-called Akkadian legend, describes how numerous cities simultaneously rebelled against Akkadian authority, requiring extensive military campaigns to suppress. These rebellions occurred precisely during the period when Naram-Sin was implementing his theological innovations and claiming divine status. The correlation suggests that local elites and temple establishments resisted the centralization of divine authority under a living god king, preferring the traditional model where multiple cult centers maintained autonomous relationships with different divine patrons. Suppressing narratives about divine conflicts served to eliminate ideological justifications for political resistance based on appeals to competing divine authorities. The erasure campaign's targeting of specific content categories reflects sophisticated understanding of which narratives pose the greatest threats to imperial theology. Passages describing territorial divisions among the Anunnaki provided templates for political fragmentation, suggesting that different regions could legitimately owe allegiance to different divine authorities and therefore different human rulers. Narratives about divine councils debating and voting on important decisions introduced democratic elements into divine governance that contradicted the absolutist model required by Akkadian imperial ideology. Stories about younger gods challenging the authority of established deities created precedents for legitimate rebellion against existing hierarchies. Each of these narrative patterns had to be systematically eliminated to create a textual foundation, supporting absolute, unified, and unchallengeable royal authority derived from equally absolute divine authority. The connection between theological censorship and political control extended beyond Naram-Sin's personal reign to become a fundamental feature of Mesopotamian imperial ideology. Subsequent rulers, including Sargon II of Assyria and Hammurabi of Babylon, continued to suppress narratives suggesting divided divine authority while promoting theological models emphasizing divine unity under supreme rulers. The long-term success of this ideological program is evident in the standardization of Mesopotamian religious texts toward increasingly centralized divine hierarchies with clear chains of command rather than the earlier models of competing divine authorities governing autonomous territories. Confirmation of Mesopotamian divine conflicts appears in external sources that escaped Sumerian editorial control, particularly in Hittite archives discovered at Hattusa that preserve Mesopotamian mythological traditions through independent transmission. The Kumarbi cycle, preserved on tablets from the Hittite capital, dating to approximately 1400 BC, describes succession conflicts among generations of gods that closely parallel Mesopotamian narratives about Anunnaki power struggles. The Hittite versions, which derive from earlier Hurrian sources ultimately based on Sumerian traditions, preserve details about divine warfare, contested kingship, and territorial divisions that match the erased passages from Nippur tablets. The consistency between these independently preserved traditions and the fragmentary Mesopotamian evidence confirms that narratives of divine conflict were not isolated innovations, but represented widespread ancient Near Eastern traditions. The discovery of the Hittite archives at Hattusa, ancient capital of the Hittite Empire located near modern Boğaz in central Turkey, occurred during excavations conducted by Hugo Winkler and Theodore Macready between 1906 and 1912. The archive rooms contained over 30,000 tablets and fragments written in multiple languages including Hittite, Hurrian, Akkadian, and Sumerian, providing unprecedented access to ancient Near Eastern intellectual traditions that had been transmitted across cultural boundaries. Among these texts, the Kumarbi cycle emerged as particularly significant for understanding Mesopotamian divine conflict narratives, because it preserved traditions that had been systematically suppressed in their original Mesopotamian contexts. The Kumarbi cycle consists of several interconnected narratives describing succession conflicts among divine generations that directly parallel the Enlil-Enki conflicts described in fragmentary Mesopotamian sources. The cycle begins with Alalu, the first king in heaven, who is overthrown by Anu after 9 years of rule. Anu in turn is challenged and defeated by Kumarbi, who bites off and swallows Anu's genitals during their conflict, thereby becoming impregnated with several deities including the storm god Teshub. Teshub eventually overthrows Kumarbi and becomes the supreme king of the gods, but faces ongoing challenges from Kumarbi's attempts to produce champions who can defeat him and restore the older god's authority. The structural parallels between the Kumarbi cycle and Mesopotamian divine conflict narratives are striking and specific. Kumarbi's role as the defeated older god who refuses to accept his subordination matches Enki's position as the earlier arriving divine administrator who contested Enlil's claimed supremacy. Teshub's role as the victorious storm god corresponds precisely to Enlil's position as lord of the atmosphere and storms who ultimately established dominance over the divine council. The ongoing conflicts described in the cycle, where Kumarbi repeatedly attempts to create champions to challenge Teshub's authority, match fragmentary Mesopotamian references to continued tensions between Enlil and Enki's factions even after formal territorial divisions were established. The transmission history of these narratives demonstrates how Mesopotamian traditions spread throughout the ancient Near East, through cultural contact and scribal exchanges. The Kumarbi cycle's colophons indicate that the Hittite versions were translated from Hurrian originals, and linguistic analysis reveals Sumerian and Akkadian loanwords throughout the texts confirming their ultimate Mesopotamian origins. The Hurrian kingdom of Mitanni, which flourished in northern Mesopotamia and Syria during the 2nd millennium BC, served as the crucial intermediary that transmitted Sumerian and Akkadian traditions to Hittite scribal schools. This transmission occurred through diplomatic contacts, scribal training programs, and the movement of educated personnel between courts, creating networks of textual exchange that preserved traditions even when they were being suppressed in their original contexts. The preservation of divine conflict narratives in Hittite contexts, while they were being systematically erased in Mesopotamia, reflects different political and theological circumstances in the two regions. Hittite royal ideology did not depend on claims of absolute divine authority transmitted through unified celestial hierarchies. Instead, Hittite kings positioned themselves as chief priests and military leaders serving the gods rather than as divinely appointed absolute rulers. This different theological foundation made narratives of divine conflicts less threatening to royal legitimacy, allowing Hittite scribes to preserve and study Mesopotamian traditions without the political imperatives that motivated erasure campaigns in Akkadian contexts. The scholarly value of the Hittite archives for reconstructing suppressed Mesopotamian traditions cannot be overstated. Comparison between Hittite versions and fragmentary Mesopotamian sources has enabled modern scholars to identify which elements of the divine conflict narratives were most systematically targeted for erasure. Passages describing specific battles between divine factions, detailed territorial divisions, and the establishment of autonomous cult centers appear prominently in Hittite versions, but are precisely the sections most thoroughly removed from Mesopotamian tablets. This correlation confirms that the erasure campaign targeted content based on its political implications rather than religious objections to divine conflict narratives per se. Additional confirmation of Mesopotamian divine conflict appears in other external sources, including Ugaritic texts from the Syrian coast that preserve parallel traditions about divine councils and contested authority among celestial administrators. The Baal cycle from Ugarit describes conflicts between the storm god Baal and other deities, including Yam and Mot, following narrative patterns closely related to Mesopotamian traditions. These West Semitic versions, like the Hittite materials, preserve elements of divine conflict narratives that had been suppressed in their Mesopotamian homeland. Providing multiple independent witnesses to the widespread distribution and fundamental importance of these traditions throughout the ancient Near Eastern cultural sphere, surviving fragments identify Ninurta, son of Enlil and warrior god, as a central figure in the Anunnaki civil conflict. Tablet Vati 10359 from the Forder Asiatisches Museum contains portions of a narrative describing Ninurta's campaign to secure his father's territorial claims against rival factions led by Enki's sons. The text describes military operations involving weapons that roar like storms and chariots that fly through the heavens, suggesting technological warfare rather than purely mythological combat. Ninurta's role as enforcer of Enlil's authority appears consistently in unerased portions of multiple texts, indicating that his military activities were too well known to completely suppress despite their documentation of divine conflict. Tablet VAT 10359, discovered during German excavations at Babylon in the early 20th century, and now housed in Berlin's Vorderasiatische Museum, preserves approximately 60% of what was originally a substantial military narrative focusing on Ninurta's campaigns. The tablet dates to the Old Babylonian period, approximately 1800 BC, but the language and orthographic features indicate it copies a much earlier Sumerian original, probably composed during the 3rd dynasty of Ur. The narrative survived the erasure campaign because it was stored in a private archive outside the main temple repositories that were systematically targeted for modification, though even this copy shows evidence of minor editorial interventions that softened some of the more explicit descriptions of divine warfare. The preserved portions of the narrative describe Ninurta receiving direct orders from Enlil to assert territorial control over disputed regions where Enki's sons had established autonomous authority. The text opens with a divine council scene, where Enlil complains that, quote 22 and quote 23, Enlil commissions Ninurta to quote 24 and quote 25. The military language and explicit territorial objectives described in this commission demonstrate that the divine conflict involved concrete, jurisdictional disputes rather than abstract theological disagreements. Ninurta's military campaigns are described in detail that suggests actual warfare rather than mythological symbolism. The text describes how Ninurta assembled his forces and equipped them with weapons of terrible power. The description of these weapons employs terminology that appears nowhere else in Mesopotamian literature, including bronze tubes that thunder and flash, and devices that hurl stones with the force of tempests. Modern scholars have debated whether these descriptions represent advanced technologies, perhaps projectile weapons or explosive devices, or whether they constitute poetic exaggeration of conventional weapons. However, the specificity of the descriptions and their consistency across multiple texts suggest that Sumerian scribes were attempting to describe actual technological capabilities that exceeded their normal experience and vocabulary. The aerial combat references present even more intriguing possibilities. The phrase "chariots that fly through the heavens" appears repeatedly in descriptions of Ninurta's campaigns, with additional details specifying that these vehicles, quote, 31, quote, and quote, 32, quote. Some passages describe how Ninurta pursued enemies, who, quote, 33, quote, and engaged them in battles that took place, quote, 34, quote. The consistency and specificity of these aerial combat descriptions across multiple independent texts suggests they preserve traditions about actual technological capabilities rather than purely mythological elaborations. The geographical scope of Ninurta's campaigns extended from the northern mountains to the southern marshlands, with specific cities mentioned as targets of military operations. The text describes campaigns against Eridu, Enki's primary cult centre, where Ninurta, quote, 35, quote, and quote, 36, quote, additional passages mention military operations at Ur and Uruk, both centres of Enki's southern alliance, with descriptions of fortifications being breached and populations being brought under Enlil's authority. The specificity of these geographical references and the detailed military operations described confirm that the narrative preserves traditions about actual territorial conflicts rather than purely symbolic religious stories. The outcome of Ninurta's campaigns, partially preserved in the tablet's concluding sections, describes a negotiated settlement rather than total victory. After extensive military operations that caused significant destruction, the text indicates that Anu, the supreme celestial authority, intervened to broker a peace agreement. The settlement formally recognized Enlil's nominal supremacy, while granting Enki autonomous authority over specifically defined southern territories. Ninurta's campaigns thus achieved their immediate objective of establishing Enlil's claims, but resulted in the territorial divisions and autonomous cult centres that characterize the actual historical organization of Mesopotamian religious institutions. The prominence of Ninurta in divine conflict narratives and his survival in unerased texts reflects the impossibility of completely suppressing traditions about such a central figure in Mesopotamian religion. Ninurta worship was widespread throughout Mesopotamia, with major cult centres at Nippur, Lagash, and numerous other cities. Annual festivals celebrating Ninurta's victories and military prowess were fundamental to religious calendars across the region. Attempting to erase all references to Ninurta's military activities would have required eliminating vast quantities of ritual texts, hymns, and festival calendars that were actively used in ongoing religious practices. The erasure campaign therefore adopted a selective strategy of removing the most explicit passages about divine conflicts, while tolerating general references to Ninurta's warrior role that could be reinterpreted as battles against demons or cosmic threats, rather than conflicts with rival Anunnaki factions. Fragmentary texts describe Enki's establishment of autonomous cult centres in southern Mesopotamia that challenged Enlil's claimed supremacy over the entire region. The Eridu Genesis, preserved in multiple copies that escaped systematic erasure due to their ritual importance, describes Enki's founding of the first city and his establishment of divine authority independent of the northern power structure centred at Nippur. Administrative texts from Ur and Uruk document substantial resources dedicated to Enki's temples that functioned as regional power centers with their own agricultural lands, craft workshops, and military forces, suggesting that the mythological narratives of divided divine authority reflected actual institutional arrangements where southern cult centers operated with significant autonomy from northern religious hierarchy. The Eridu Genesis represents one of the most important Sumerian creation narratives, and its survival, despite the erasure campaign, demonstrates the practical limitations of attempts to suppress texts that remained central to ongoing religious practices. Multiple copies of this composition have been recovered from sites including Nippur and Sippur, with the most complete version preserved on tablet CBS 10673 from the University of Pennsylvania's Nippur collection. The text's ritual function in temple ceremonies celebrating Enki's creative activities and Eridu's sacred status made it impossible to eliminate without disrupting fundamental religious observances. The erasure campaign therefore left this text largely intact while removing related narratives that explicitly described Enki's conflicts with Enlil's authority. The Eridu Genesis describes how Enki established the first permanent settlement on Earth in the southern marshlands where the Euphrates River flows into the Persian Gulf. The text emphasizes Enki's role as pioneer and civilizer who transformed uninhabitable swamplands into productive agricultural territory through advanced hydraulic engineering. This foundational narrative established Enki's claim to autonomous authority based on priority of settlement and technical expertise rather than hierarchical appointment from celestial authorities. The implications for political theology were significant, as the text provided justification for southern cult centers to operate independently of northern religious administration based on historical precedents and specialized knowledge. Archaeological evidence from Eridu confirms the extraordinary antiquity and continuous sacred importance of the site. Excavations conducted by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd between 1946 and 1949 revealed 18 successive temple levels spanning from approximately 5400 BC to 500 BC, making Eridu one of the longest continuously occupied sacred sites in Mesopotamia. The earliest temple levels demonstrate architectural sophistication that appears fully formed rather than evolving gradually from simpler structures, supporting traditions that Eridu's founding involved transfer of advanced knowledge and techniques rather than indigenous development. The continuous rebuilding of Enki's temple on precisely the same sacred location for nearly 5 millennia demonstrates the enduring importance of his cult, independent of political changes that saw control of Mesopotamia shift between numerous dynasties and empires. Administrative texts from Ur provide detailed evidence of the institutional autonomy and substantial resources controlled by Enki's southern cult centers. The Third Period archive, recovered during Leonard Woolley's excavations between 1922 and 1934, contains thousands of tablets documenting temple administration. These records reveal that Enki's temples controlled vast agricultural estates worked by thousands of dependent labourers, operated large-scale craft workshops producing textiles, metalwork and pottery, and maintained what the texts term the Temple Guard, military forces that provided security and enforced the temple's economic interests. The scale of resources under temple control matched or exceeded those available to contemporary royal administrations, confirming that major cult centers functioned as autonomous power centers with economic and military capabilities independent of central political authority. Similar patterns appear in administrative records from Uruk, where Inanna's temple complex controlled comparable resources and operated with substantial autonomy from both royal and northern religious authority. The sacred precinct at Uruk, covering approximately 100 hectares and containing multiple temples, workshops and administrative buildings, functioned as a virtual city-state within the city. Temple archives document independent diplomatic relations with other cities, control over trade networks extending to the Persian Gulf and Anatolia, and military forces capable of defending temple interests. The institutional autonomy evident in these administrative records directly parallels mythological narratives describing how Enki established independent divine authority in southern Mesopotamia that did not depend on hierarchical appointment from Enlil's northern administration. The geographical distribution of major cult centers reflects the territorial divisions described in divine conflict narratives. Enlil's primary center at Nippur occupied a central position that gave it strategic control over the entire Mesopotamian plain, while Enki's Eridu commanded the southern approaches and access to the Persian Gulf. Inanna's Uruk controlled the middle Euphrates region, while Nanna's dominated the southeastern territories. This distribution created multiple power centers whose interests could conflict over water rights, trade routes, agricultural territories, and human populations. The mythological narratives of divine territorial disputes thus reflected actual institutional competition between major temple complexes whose economic and political interests regularly came into conflict despite their shared religious culture. The long-term persistence of this pattern of autonomous cult centers maintained practical barriers to political centralization throughout Mesopotamian history. Even powerful empires like Akkad, Ur III, and Babylon had to negotiate with major temple establishments rather than simply imposing royal authority. The economic resources and popular loyalty commanded by temple centers gave them substantial political leverage that limited the practical exercise of royal power. This institutional reality made the theological model of divided divine authority more accurate than the unified hierarchy promoted by royal ideology. Explaining why the erasure campaign against divine conflict narratives required ongoing effort rather than achieving permanent success. Partially erased passages from several tablets indicate that control over human genetic development represented a major source of conflict between Anunnaki factions. Tablet CBS 14061 preserves fragmentary references to disputes about, quote, 38, quote, and, quote, 39, quote, suggesting disagreements about authority over human creation and modification. The Atrosis epic, which survives in relatively complete form due to its ritual significance, describes tensions between Enlil and Enki regarding the creation of humans to serve as labourers, with Enki taking a protective role toward human populations against Enlil's more exploitative approach. The erasure campaign specifically targeted passages that elaborated on these genetic authority disputes, presumably because they undermined the unified divine authority that supported royal legitimacy claims. Tablet CBS 14061, housed in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, preserves approximately 40% of what was originally an extensive narrative focusing on debates within the Divine Council about the creation and modification of human beings. The preserved portions indicate heated arguments about which Anunnaki faction should control human genetic development, with Enlil insisting on his authority as Lord of the Command, while Enki claimed technical expertise in biological manipulation gave him natural jurisdiction. The text describes how the assembly could not reach agreement, and each god asserted his right to shape the clay, indicating that human creation occurred within a context of contested divine authority rather than unified decision-making. The terminology used in these disputed passages employs technical language that suggests sophisticated understanding of genetic manipulation rather than simple clay-moulding metaphors. References to mixing the divine essence with earthly clay and implanting the breath that gives knowledge appear throughout the fragmentary text, with additional passages describing how different Anunnaki contributed distinct genetic materials to produce humans with specific capabilities. Modern scholars analysing this terminology have noted striking parallels with contemporary genetic engineering concepts, though interpretations remain controversial regarding whether the ancient texts preserve memories of actual biotechnology, or employ metaphorical language that coincidentally resembles modern scientific vocabulary. The Atrahasis epic provides the most complete surviving account of human creation and the tensions between Enlil and Enki regarding human populations. This old Babylonian composition, preserved in multiple copies from Sippar, Nineveh, and other sites, describes how the Agigi gods revolted against the harsh labour requirements imposed by the Anunnaki leadership. To resolve this crisis, the Divine Council decided to create humans as substitute workers. The epic describes how Enki designed humans by mixing clay with the blood of a slain god, implanting divine intelligence while maintaining sufficient limitations to prevent humans from challenging divine authority. Enki's technical role in human creation established his ongoing protective relationship with human populations throughout subsequent narrative developments. The conflict between Enlil and Enki over human populations emerges clearly in the Atrahasis epic's flood narrative. As human populations grew and prospered under Enki's protective supervision, Enlil became increasingly disturbed by human noise and independence. The epic describes how Enlil implemented a series of population control measures, including plague, drought, and famine, each of which Enki circumvented through technical interventions that preserved human populations. The escalating conflict culminated in Enlil's decision to destroy humanity entirely through a great flood. While Enki secretly warned the human Atrahasis and provided instructions for building a survival vessel, the narrative explicitly portrays this conflict as a dispute over authority and appropriate treatment of human populations rather than divine caprice or moral judgment. The erasure campaign targeted passages that elaborated on the genetic authority disputes because they raised fundamental questions about the unity and coherence of divine authority. If different Anunnaki factions had contributed distinct genetic materials to human creation, did humans owe primary allegiance to their principal creator or to the nominally supreme divine administrator? If Enki's technical expertise gave him natural authority over human genetic development, did this create a legitimate basis for human populations to resist directives from Enlil's hierarchy? These questions had obvious implications for royal legitimacy claims based on divine appointment, as they introduced ambiguity about which divine authority human rulers actually represented, and whether competing claims to represent different divine factions could be simultaneously legitimate. The political sensitivity of human creation narratives becomes evident when examining which versions survived and which were targeted for modification. The Atrahasis epic survived relatively intact because its ritual importance in ceremonies addressing drought, plague, and other disasters made it impractical to suppress entirely. However, comparison between early Sumerian versions and later Akkadian redactions reveals systematic modifications that downplayed conflicts between Enlil and Enki, while emphasizing the unity of divine decision-making. Passages describing heated arguments and contested authority were softened or removed, while additions emphasized that even Enki's protective actions occurred with Enlil's ultimate approval. These modifications served the same ideological purposes as the physical erasure campaign, reshaping narratives to support theological models of unified divine authority. Physical archaeological evidence supports textual descriptions of competing divine power centers through examination of temple construction patterns and resource allocation across Mesopotamian sites. Excavations at Nippur reveal that Enlil's Akur temple complex received continuous royal patronage and served as the primary repository for cuneiform archives, establishing it as the religious administrative centre. However, contemporary construction at Eridu, Ur, and Uruk demonstrates that southern cities maintained temple complexes of comparable or greater architectural sophistication dedicated to Enki, Nana, and Inanna, indicating that substantial resources were independently controlled by southern cult centres. The archaeological pattern matches textual descriptions of divided divine authority, with multiple power centres competing for resources and influence. The Eka Temple complex at Nippur, excavated extensively by the University of Pennsylvania between 1888 and 1900, and by subsequent expeditions through the 1960s, occupied approximately 20 hectares within the city's sacred precinct. The central ziggurat, originally rising approximately 40 meters above the surrounding plain, was surrounded by a complex of temples, administrative buildings, and archive rooms that house the most extensive collection of cuneiform tablets recovered from any single Mesopotamian site. The architectural sophistication of the Eka complex reflects continuous investment and rebuilding across multiple dynasties from the early dynastic period through the Neo-Babylonian era, demonstrating that Enlil's cult center maintained preeminent status regardless of political changes affecting the region. The archive rooms at Nippur contained over 30,000 tablets spanning administrative, literary, religious, and educational texts, establishing the site as the primary center for scribal training and textual preservation throughout Mesopotamian history. The concentration of textual resources at Nippur gave Enlil's priesthood unparalleled influence over religious education and the standardization of mythological traditions. This institutional advantage enabled Nippur's authorities to shape how divine narratives were transmitted across generations, providing the infrastructure necessary for implementing the systematic erasure campaign against texts describing divine conflicts. The centralization of scrial education at Nippur meant that generations of scribes trained in standardized interpretations of divine authority that emphasized Enlil's supremacy and downplayed narratives of competing divine factions. Despite Nippur's institutional dominance, archaeological evidence from southern cult centers demonstrates that substantial resources and architectural sophistication were invested in temples serving rival divine authorities. Excavations at Eridu conducted by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd between 1946 and 1949 revealed temple construction spanning from the Ubaid period around 5400 BC through the Neo-Babylonian period, with each rebuilding phase maintaining or exceeding the architectural quality of its predecessor. The earliest temple levels at Eridu demonstrate construction techniques including sophisticated foundation systems, complex floor plans with multiple chambers, and decorative elements that indicate access to specialized craftsmen and substantial economic resources. The continuity of high-quality construction across millennia demonstrates that Enki's cult maintained autonomous access to resources independent of northern religious administration. The temple complex at excavated by Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934, provides even more dramatic evidence of southern cult center wealth and independence. The ziggurat dedicated to the moon god Nana, built during the 3rd dynasty of around 2100 BC, originally stood approximately 30 meters high, with a base measuring approximately 62 meters by 43 meters. The construction employed over 720,000 baked bricks, representing an enormous investment in materials and labor that exceeded resources typically available to single city-states. The ziggurat formed the centerpiece of a vast sacred precinct covering approximately 40 hectares that included multiple temples, administrative buildings, workshops, and residential quarters for temple personnel. The scale and quality of construction at rivals or exceeds that found at Nippur, demonstrating that southern cult centers commanded comparable resources and technical expertise. The royal cemetery at provides additional evidence of the wealth and sophistication concentrated in southern cult centers. The cemetery contained over 2,000 burials, including 16 royal tombs, dating to approximately 2600 BC, that contained extraordinary quantities of gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and carnelian artifacts demonstrating advanced metallurgical and lapidary techniques. The famous death pits associated with these royal tombs, where dozens of attendants were apparently sacrificed to accompany deceased rulers, indicate social organizational capabilities and religious authority that operated independently of northern religious hierarchy. concentration of wealth and the elaborate ritual practices documented at confirm textual descriptions of autonomous southern power centres that did not require northern authorization for their religious and political activities. Uruk provides perhaps the most compelling archaeological evidence for temple complexes functioning as independent power centres. Excavations at the site, beginning with those conducted by Julius Jordan between 1912 and 1913, and continuing through multiple German expeditions into the 21st century, have revealed an urban complex where religious institutions dominated all aspects of city life. The Inanna precinct dedicated to the goddess Inanna covered approximately 9 hectares and included massive temple platforms, ceremonial buildings, and administrative facilities that demonstrate architectural sophistication exceeding contemporary construction elsewhere in Mesopotamia. The earliest monumental architecture at Uruk, dating to approximately 3400 BC, includes the limestone temple and the mosaic temple, which employed decorative techniques including limestone cladding and cone mosaic patterns that required specialized craftsmen and substantial economic investment. The administrative tablets recovered from Uruk's temple precincts document the extent of institutional autonomy and economic power concentrated in these cult centers. The archaic tablets from the late 4th millennium BC represent some of the earliest examples of writing and focus almost exclusively on temple economic activities, including management of agricultural lands, craft production, and labour forces numbering in the thousands. These records demonstrate that temple administrations at Uruk operated complex economic systems that included long-distance trade, specialised craft production, and agricultural estates spanning vast territories. The institutional independence documented in these administrative records matches textual descriptions of divine authority that operated autonomously from central hierarchical control. Comparative analysis of temple architecture across Mesopotamian sites reveals standardized construction techniques and architectural symbolism that indicate shared religious culture despite institutional autonomy. The ziggurat form itself, with its characteristic stage construction and directional orientation, appears at Nippur, Uruk, and numerous other sites, demonstrating common architectural traditions that transcended local political boundaries. However, the variations in scale, proportions, and decorative elements reflect local adaptations and autonomous decision-making by temple authorities rather than centralized architectural planning. This pattern of cultural unity combined with institutional diversity perfectly matches textual descriptions of Anunnaki factions that shared common origins and culture, while maintaining competing territorial jurisdictions and autonomous administrative structures. Understanding the sophistication of the erasure campaign requires detailed examination of the technical processes involved in modifying and preserving altered tablets. Experimental archaeology conducted by researchers at the British Museum demonstrated that the modification process required specialized knowledge of ceramic materials and firing techniques. The erasure tools, based on metallurgical analysis of embedded trace elements, were precision instruments crafted from copper alloys with specific hardness characteristics that could remove clay without causing structural damage to the tablet. The secondary firing process required even more sophisticated knowledge, as insufficient heat would leave the edited tablets vulnerable to deterioration, while excessive temperatures would cause warping or complete destruction. The technical expertise demonstrated by these modification processes indicates that the erasure campaign was carried out by highly trained specialists who possessed advanced knowledge of material science. The experimental archaeology program initiated by Irving Finkel and Christopher Walker at the British Museum in 1987 attempted to replicate the ancient tablet modification processes using materials and techniques that would have been available to Akkadian period craftsmen. The experiments revealed that successful tablet modification required coordination of multiple specialized skills including metallurgy, ceramics, and scribal expertise. The erasure tools themselves posed significant fabrication challenges, as the copper alloys needed to be hardened through specific alloying and heat treatment processes to achieve the correct balance between hardness sufficient to scrape fired clay and ductility necessary to prevent brittle fracture during use. Modern metallurgical analysis indicates that achieving these material properties required understanding of bronze composition ratios and heat treatment cycles that exceeded typical ancient Near Eastern metalworking practices. The scraping process itself demanded extraordinary skill and patience to remove inscribed text without compromising tablet structural integrity. Experimental attempts demonstrated that excessive pressure during scraping could cause cracks that would propagate during the refiring process, destroying the entire tablet. Insufficient pressure left residual traces of original inscriptions that could potentially be read, defeating the purpose of the erasure. The ancient craftsmen who performed these erasures maintained remarkably consistent depths between 0.5 and 1.2 millimeters across thousands of tablets, indicating either extensive training or the development of specialized tools with built-in depth controls. The parallel groove patterns visible under microscopic examination suggest the use of multi-tined scrapers that removed material in uniform strips rather than single-point tools that would have required numerous individual passes. The surface smoothing process following initial erasure presented additional technical challenges that required knowledge of abrasive materials and their interactions with clay surfaces. The quartz particles identified through scanning electron microscopy had been carefully sized to fall within a narrow range of 50 to 100 micrometers, small enough to create smooth surfaces but large enough to remove material efficiently. The size uniformity suggests that the abrasive compounds were prepared through sieving or other separation techniques that isolated specific particle size fractions. The binding agents that suspended these abrasives have decomposed over millennia, but residual chemical signatures suggest the use of organic materials, possibly including plant gums or proteins that created workable pastes with appropriate viscosity for controlled application. The reinscription of alternative texts on the prepared surfaces required specialized scribal skills that combined traditional cuneiform writing techniques with knowledge of how modified clay surfaces would accept new impressions. Experimental work demonstrated that erased and smooth tablets develop surface properties that differ from fresh clay, affecting how deeply stylus impressions can be made and how clearly wedge marks appear. Ancient scribes adapted their inscription techniques to account for these altered material properties, generally creating deeper impressions and more deliberately formed signs than typical cuneiform writing, to ensure the replacement text would be clearly legible. The refiring process represented the most technically demanding and risky phase of the entire modification procedure. Ceramic engineering principles dictate that clay bodies undergo irreversible chemical and physical changes during firing that make them susceptible to thermal shock and structural failure if reheated. The original firing of cuneiform tablets typically occurred at temperatures between 600 and 700 degrees Celsius, sufficient to harden the clay without causing excessive vitrification. The secondary firing required to preserve modifications needed to reach approximately 950 degrees Celsius to fully harden the reinscribed text while avoiding temperatures above 1050 degrees Celsius, where clay begins to deform and melt. Achieving and maintaining these precise temperature ranges required sophisticated kiln design and fuel management. Experimental attempts using reconstructed ancient kilns demonstrated the difficulty of reaching 950 degrees Celsius temperatures using wood or charcoal fuel, which typically produces maximum temperatures around 800 degrees Celsius in simple kilns. Achieving higher temperatures required either advanced kiln designs that maximize thermal efficiency through careful placement of fuel and tablets, or the use of supplementary fuels such as bitumen or petroleum products that produce higher combustion temperatures. The uniform success of ancient tablet refiring across thousands of modified tablets indicates that whoever organized the erasure campaign had access to specialized firing facilities and technical expertise that exceeded normal ceramic production capabilities. The temperature control during refiring proved crucial because tablets needed to be heated uniformly throughout their volume without creating internal stress concentrations that would cause cracking. Ceramic thermal analysis demonstrates that thick tablets conduct heat slowly, creating temperature gradients between surface and core that generate mechanical stresses during both heating and cooling phases. The ancient craftsmen solved this problem through carefully controlled firing cycles that involved gradual temperature increases, extended hold times at peak temperature to allow thermal equilibration, and slow cooling periods that prevented thermal shock. The survival of modified tablets in excellent condition demonstrates mastery of time-temperature profiles that modern ceramic engineers recognize as optimal for avoiding thermal stress damage. Examination of the replacement texts inscribed over erased passages reveals a standardized alternative narrative that was systematically substituted for the original conflict descriptions. Multiple tablets show identical or nearly identical replacement. Passages that emphasize divine harmony, coordinated administration, and voluntary cooperation among Anunnaki factions. Tablet N7856 from Nippur contains a replacement passage describing how quote, _45 directly contradicting the partially preserved original text that describe military conflict and forced territorial concessions. The standardization of these replacement narratives indicates that scribes worked from official guidelines or templates that specified not only which content to remove but also what alternative narratives should replace erased. Passages. Tablet N7856, catalogued in the University Museum's Nippur collection, provides the clearest example of standardized replacement narratives because advances in imaging technology have revealed portions of the underlying erased text that directly contradict the overlying replacement passage. Reflectance. Transformation. Imaging conducted in 2015 revealed that the original text described how Enlil assembled his warriors and marched against the southern cities, and how the armies met at the boundary stones and great destruction followed. The replacement text inscribed over this passage states that Enlil and Enki met in council and agreed upon the division, and that each god received his appointed domain and was content. The direct contradiction between original and replacement text demonstrates that the erasure campaign did not merely suppress controversial content, but actively replaced historical narratives with propaganda that supported imperial theological objectives. The standardization of replacement narratives appears across multiple tablets from different find contexts, indicating centralized production of official alternative texts rather than local improvisation by individual scribes. Comparison of replacement passages on tablets. N7856, CBS 10894, and HS1467 reveals nearly identical wording with only minor variations in grammatical particles and determinatives. The core phrases, including divided the lands in peace, established their seats in harmony, and each god received his appointed domain, appear verbatim across all three tablets, despite their recovery from different archive rooms and archaeological contexts. This consistency could only have resulted from scribes working from standardized templates that specified exact replacement wording rather than general guidance about alternative narratives. The creation of these standardized replacement templates required extensive preliminary work by scholars familiar with both the original texts and imperial theological objectives. The templates needed to identify specific passages requiring removal with sufficient precision that different scribes working independently could locate identical sections across various copies of the same compositions. The replacement passages needed to maintain narrative coherence with surrounding unmodified text, while systematically reversing the ideological content from conflict to harmony. The intellectual effort required for this planning phase suggests that the erasure campaign involved senior scholars and religious authorities who possessed deep knowledge of Mesopotamian literary traditions and understood precisely which elements contradicted imperial ideology. The distribution of standardized replacement templates to multiple Scribble workshops required administrative coordination and secure communication channels to prevent unauthorized copying or distribution of the suppressed original texts. The logistics of this distribution process remain largely mysterious because no administrative records documenting the erasure campaign have survived, presumably because they themselves were eventually destroyed to conceal evidence of the systematic censorship program. However, the successful implementation of standardized modifications across multiple sites demonstrates effective coordination mechanisms that could transmit detailed technical instructions and ideological guidance throughout the Akkadian imperial administrative system. The replacement narratives consistently emphasize themes that supported centralized royal authority and theological unity. Divine conflicts were systematically rewritten as peaceful negotiations, military conquest became voluntary submissions, and contested authority transformed into harmonious division of labor under unified supreme command. These narrative modifications served immediate political purposes by eliminating ideological justifications for regional autonomy and resistance to centralized authority. By presenting divine governance as inherently unified and hierarchical, the replacement narratives provided theological models that legitimized imperial political structures, claiming to replicate divine administrative patterns. The long-term effectiveness of the erasure campaign's standardized replacements is evident in how later Mesopotamian literature consistently adopts the harmonious divine council model rather than preserving traditions of divine conflict. Babylonian compositions from the 2nd and 1st millennia BC present divine assemblies as deliberative bodies that reach consensus under supreme leadership, rather than as forums for contested authority and factional disputes. This narrative standardization reflects the successful reshaping of theological consciousness achieved through systematic modification of earlier texts combined with educational systems that transmitted modified versions to subsequent generations without access to suppressed originals. Despite the systematic erasure of explicit conflict narratives, indirect references in royal inscriptions inadvertently preserve evidence of the Anunnaki civil war. The inscription of Lugal-Zaggisi, who briefly unified Sumer before Sargon's conquest, describes his authority as granted by Enlil, who made all lands bow down and who conquered the rebellious regions, using language that implies prior resistance to Enlil's authority. Similarly, inscriptions from Akkadian kings refer to their role in Quote 55 and Quote 56, suggesting ongoing diplomatic efforts to prevent renewed divine conflicts. These indirect references, which appeared in public monuments rather than scribal archives, escaped systematic erasure because removing them would have required physically altering highly visible royal monuments. The inscription of Lugal-Zaggisi, preserved on clay cones and stone fragments, recovered from multiple sites including Nippur and Uruk, dates to approximately 2370 BC and documents his brief period of supremacy over most of Sumer before Sargon of Akkad's conquest. The text describes how Enlil granted Lugal-Zaggisi kingship over from the Lower Sea to the Upper Sea, encompassing the entire Mesopotamian plain. The significant phrase appears when describing the extent of divine authority. Enlil, who made all lands bow down, and who conquered the rebellious regions and established his authority over the four quarters. This language explicitly acknowledges that regions had been rebellious and required conquest, implying that Enlil's authority was not universally accepted but had to be imposed through military force. The theological implications of this phraseology directly contradict the harmonious divine council model promoted through the erasure campaign. If Enlil had to make lands bow down and conquer rebellious regions, this acknowledges the existence of legitimate alternative authorities that resisted his supremacy and required military subjugation. The inscription survives because it was carved on public monuments, celebrating Lugal-Zaggisi's achievements and removing it would have required destroying or defacing prominent royal dedications. The practical difficulty of modifying stone inscriptions displayed in temple precincts and public spaces created a preservation category that escaped the systematic modification applied to clay tablets in archive repositories. Akkadian royal inscriptions contain similar inadvertent acknowledgements of divine conflicts through references to ongoing diplomatic maintenance required to prevent renewed hostilities. The inscription of Rimush, Sargon's son who ruled approximately 2270 BC, describes how the king performed rituals 60 and made offerings 61. These phrases appear in the context of describing Rimush's religious activities and temple construction projects, embedded within passages celebrating divine support for royal authority. The casual references to peace maintenance and boundary security imply ongoing tensions that required active diplomatic management rather than inherent harmony among divine factions. The phrase, "great houses," employed in these inscriptions carries specific institutional meaning referring to major temple establishments serving as centers of divine authority. The plural form acknowledges multiple centers of religious power rather than unified hierarchy, while the need to maintain peace between them admits the possibility of conflict if diplomatic efforts failed. Similarly, references to boundaries established by the gods that require security measures acknowledge that territorial divisions exist and might be contested, contradicting narratives of voluntary harmonious cooperation. These indirect acknowledgements preserve evidence of divine conflicts precisely because they appear as background assumptions within texts focused on royal achievements rather than as primary narratives subject to systematic censorship. Additional indirect evidence appears in royal references to their role as mediators or guarantors of divine agreements. The inscription of Naram-Sin on the Basaki statue describes the king as who maintains justice between the gods and who preserves the ordinances established in heaven. This mediator role implies that conflicts between gods require human royal intervention to maintain resolution, suggesting that divine agreements are unstable and require ongoing enforcement. The image of a human king maintaining justice between gods reverses the typical hierarchical model, where divine unity provides the foundation for human justice, inadvertently acknowledging that divine authority itself was contested and required active management. The inscriptional evidence gains additional significance when examined alongside votive offerings and building dedications that reference multiple divine authorities simultaneously. Numerous royal inscriptions describe construction projects or military campaigns as undertaken with support from multiple deities listed in sequence, including both Enlil and Enki, or Enlil and Inanna, combinations that the conflict narratives identify as rival factions. The need to acknowledge multiple divine patrons in public inscriptions reflects political realities, where different regions and populations owed primary allegiance to different cult centers. Kings seeking to rule diverse territories needed to claim authority from multiple divine sources, implicitly acknowledging divided divine jurisdiction rather than unified hierarchical authority. The survival of these indirect references in royal inscriptions while mythological conflict narratives were systematically erased reveals the practical limitations of ancient censorship campaigns. Public monuments serving political legitimation functions could not be easily modified without undermining the authority they were intended to establish. The visibility and permanence of stone inscriptions made them resistant to systematic alteration, creating a preserved category of evidence that inadvertently documents the very conflicts that censorship campaigns sought to conceal. The contrast between suppressed mythological narratives and surviving royal inscriptions demonstrates how different textual genres and physical formats created varying degrees of vulnerability to systematic modification. Linguistic analysis of Sumerian and Akkadian vocabulary reveals traces of suppressed terminology related to divine conflict. Early Sumerian texts contain terms like Nam-Shul, divine conflict, and Uru-Nim, city of strife. that essentially disappear from later textual traditions following the erasure campaign. Comparative analysis with related Semitic languages shows that cognate terms continued in use in other Near Eastern contexts, confirming that their disappearance from Mesopotamian texts resulted from deliberate suppression rather than natural linguistic evolution. The Akkadian Dictionary Project at the University of Chicago has documented numerous gaps in the semantic fields related to divine conflict and competition, suggesting systematic removal of vocabulary that could describe Anunnaki civil war. The term Namshul appears in early Sumerian administrative and literary texts dating to the early dynastic period, approximately 2600 to 2300 BC, with the meaning divine conflict or strife among the gods. The compound combines Nam, a prefix indicating abstract concepts or states of being, with Shul meaning young man or warrior, creating a term that specifically denotes martial conflict among divine beings. Texts from Shurupak and Farah employ this term in contexts describing disputes among gods over territorial boundaries and cult privileges. However, lexical lists and literary compositions from the Akkadian period onward show systematic avoidance of this term, with later scribes employing circumlocutions or alternative terminology when describing divine interactions that earlier texts would have characterized using Namshul. The lexical tradition provides crucial evidence for tracking the suppression of conflict terminology through time. Sumerian lexical lists served as standardized reference works for scribal training, organizing vocabulary by semantic categories and providing Akkadian translation equivalents for Sumerian terms. The lexical list known as Proto-Ea, dating to the Old Babylonian period around 1800 BC, contains numerous terms for human conflict including Namtag, battle, Namuru, strife, and Namshi, discord, but notably omits Namshul despite its appearance in earlier literary texts. This systematic exclusion from lexical reference works effectively removed the term from active scribal vocabulary, as scribes trained through the standardized lexical tradition would have no authorized terminology for describing divine conflicts. Similarly, the term Uru-Nim, literally high city but carrying connotations of city of strife, or contested settlement, appears in early dynastic texts describing cities whose divine patronage was disputed between rival Anunnaki factions. Administrative documents from Lagash employ this term when referencing boundary disputes with neighbouring Ummah, framing the political conflict as reflecting divine territorial disagreements. Later textual traditions systematically replace Oranim with neutral geographical designations that acknowledge urban settlement without implying contested status. The disappearance of this specialized terminology eliminated linguistic frameworks for understanding political conflicts as reflections of divine territorial disputes, supporting ideological models that presented political boundaries as divinely ordained and uncontestable. Comparative Semitic linguistics provides external validation that these terminological gaps result from deliberate suppression rather than natural language evolution. Akkadian, a Semitic language, borrowed extensively from Sumerian religious and administrative vocabulary, but shows systematic gaps in terminology related to divine conflict. However, related Semitic languages, including Ugaritic, Hebrew, and Aramaic, preserve cognate terms with meanings related to divine or celestial conflict. The Ugaritic term TRT, cognate with Akkadian tertum meaning oracle or omen, appears in contexts describing conflicts within the divine council that closely parallel Mesopotamian divine conflict narratives. The preservation of these terms in Western Semitic languages while they disappear from Akkadian confirms that their absence from Mesopotamian textual traditions results from deliberate suppression rather than shared linguistic evolution. The Akkadian Dictionary Project, a comprehensive lexicographical undertaking initiated by the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago in 1921 and continuing through the 21st century, has systematically documented the vocabulary of Akkadian language based on comprehensive review of cuneiform sources. The dictionary's semantic field analysis reveals systematic gaps in terminology related to divine conflict, competition, and contested authority. While Akkadian possesses extensive vocabulary for human warfare, political conflict, and social discord, it notably lacks equivalent terminology specifically designating conflicts among gods. The asymmetry between robust human conflict vocabulary and absent divine conflict terminology suggests deliberate lexical suppression rather than conceptual limitations of the language. The Dictionary Project's documentation of these gaps has enabled reconstruction of probable suppressed terminology through comparative analysis with early Sumerian sources and related languages. Scholars have identified approximately 30 Sumerian terms related to divine conflict that appear in early dynastic texts but disappear from later lexical traditions. The systematic nature of these disappearances, concentrated precisely in semantic fields related to divine territorial disputes, contested authority, and factional conflicts, demonstrates intentional rather than random vocabulary loss. The correlation between these lexical gaps and the physical erasure of mythological conflict narratives confirms that the suppression campaign operated across multiple dimensions of textual culture, eliminating not only specific narratives, but also the linguistic frameworks necessary for conceptualizing and discussing divine conflicts. The elevation of Marduk to supreme divine status in later Babylonian theology represents a continuation of the erasure campaign's objectives through alternative means. The Enuma Elish, composed during the Old Babylonian period, presents Marduk as the undisputed king of the gods who defeated primordial chaos and established cosmic order, effectively overwriting earlier narratives of competing divine factions with a monarchical theology centered on a single supreme deity. This theological revision served the political interests of Babylonian kings, who claimed direct appointment by Marduk, but it also eliminated the conceptual framework for understanding divine conflict by presenting divine authority as inherently unified under Marduk's kingship. The Enuma Elish thus represents theological erasure complementing the physical tablet modifications from earlier periods. The Enuma Elish, preserved in multiple copies from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh and from Babylon itself, represents the most sophisticated theological response to the problem of divine conflict narratives. The composition, dating to approximately 1800 BC based on linguistic features and historical context, completely reimagines Mesopotamian cosmology by placing Marduk at the center of creation rather than presenting him as one among many competing divine administrators. The text opens with primordial chaos represented by the mingling waters of Apsu and Tiamat, from which emerge successive generations of gods whose activities disturb the primordial deities. The resulting conflict culminates in Marduk's defeat of Tiamat and his use of her corpse to create the ordered cosmos, establishing his supreme kingship through martial prowess and creative power. The theological innovation of the Enuma Elish lies in its presentation of cosmic order as emerging from Marduk's victory over chaos rather than from negotiations among competing divine administrators. Earlier Sumerian creation narratives, as preserved in fragmentary form, described how different Anunnaki members contributed to creating various aspects of the cosmos through collaborative or competitive processes. The Enuma Elish systematically replaces this model of distributed creative authority with a monarchical theology where Marduk alone possesses the power to establish cosmic order. After defeating Tiamat, Marduk creates the heavens and earth, establishes the movements of celestial bodies, and organizes the divine council with himself as undisputed king. The other gods voluntarily accept subordinate positions, acknowledging Marduk's supremacy and receiving their assigned functions within his ordered hierarchy. The political implications of this theological revision become explicit in the text's description of Marduk's acquisition of supreme authority. Before confronting Tiamat, Marduk negotiates with the divine assembly, demanding that they grant him permanent kingship if he successfully defeats the chaos monster. The gods agree, formulating what the text calls the decree of destinies, establishing that your word shall be supreme in the assembly and your command shall be unchangeable. After Marduk's victory, the divine assembly reaffirms his kingship, declaring that _quote_82_. This narrative of voluntary divine submission to a supreme monarch provided the theological template for Babylonian royal ideology, where human kings ruled as appointed representatives of an absolutely supreme divine authority. The Enuma Elish's treatment of earlier divine conflicts appears in its reinterpretation of traditional Anunnaki figures within Marduk's hierarchical system. Enlil, who in earlier traditions claimed supreme authority as, quote, 83, is reinterpreted in the Enuma Elish as receiving his authority from Marduk rather than possessing it independently. The text describes how Marduk, quote, 84, quote-unquote, 85, quote, framing Enlil's authority as delegated rather than original. Similarly, Enki appears in the Enuma Elish as Ea, Marduk's father and advisor, but without the autonomous creative authority attributed to him in earlier traditions. By reframing traditional Anunnaki figures as recipients of Marduk's delegated authority, the Enuma Elish eliminated the conceptual framework for understanding them as independent power centers that could legitimately compete for supremacy. The ritual function of the Enuma Elish reinforced its theological revisionism through annual recitation during the Babylonian New Year festival, known as Akitu. The ritual program for this festival, documented in texts from the Seleucid period, but clearly based on much earlier traditions, specified that the Enuma Elish be recited in its entirety on the fourth day of the 12-day celebration. This ritual context ensured that Marduk's supremacy and the unified hierarchical model of divine authority received annual public affirmation before the assembled population of Babylon. The combination of impressive ceremonial display, royal participation, and authoritative textual recitation created a powerful mechanism for transmitting and reinforcing the theological revision that eliminated divine conflict from official religious consciousness. The success of the Marduk-centered theological revision is evident in how later Babylonian texts consistently adopt the Enuma Elish's hierarchical model, even when discussing earlier historical periods. Babylonian chronicles and king lists from the first millennium BC describe ancient events using theological frameworks that present Marduk as the supreme authority even for periods predating the composition of the Enuma Elish. This anachronistic application of later theology to earlier periods demonstrates how effectively the Enuma Elish reshaped historical consciousness by providing the dominant interpretive framework through which all divine activities were understood. The earlier narratives of competing divine factions became literally unthinkable within a theological system that defined divine authority as inherently unified under supreme monarchical rule. The transmission of the Enuma Elish beyond Babylonian contexts extended its theological influence throughout the ancient Near East. Assyrian copies of the text, while occasionally substituting Ashur for Marduk to reflect Assyrian political priorities, maintained the fundamental structure of monarchical divine authority that eliminated conceptual space for divine conflicts. The text's influence appears even in peripheral regions where Babylonian cultural influence operated indirectly through scribal education and religious exchange. The widespread adoption of hierarchical divine monarchy as the standard theological model demonstrates the Enuma Elish's success in replacing earlier traditions that acknowledged divine conflicts and competing authorities. Egyptian religious texts preserve parallel evidence of divine conflicts that illuminate the Mesopotamian erasure campaign through comparative analysis. The pyramid texts and coffin texts contain extensive narratives describing conflicts between Horus and Set, competing claims to divine kingship, and territorial divisions among the gods that match structural patterns found in fragmentary Mesopotamian texts. The Egyptian tradition of divine conflict remained part of public religious knowledge, incorporated into mortuary rituals and temple ceremonies without the systematic suppression evident in Mesopotamia. This contrast suggests that Mesopotamian authorities uniquely perceived divine conflict narratives as threatening to political stability, possibly because Mesopotamian city-states maintained competing cult centers with genuine institutional autonomy, while Egyptian theology was more successfully centralized under pharaonic control. The pyramid texts, inscribed in the burial chambers of pyramids from the late 5th dynasty and 6th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, approximately 2400 to 2200 BC, preserve the earliest substantial corpus of Egyptian religious literature. These texts, totaling over 700 distinct utterances or spells, include extensive narratives describing conflicts between Horus and Set following the murder of Osiris. The conflict narratives describe military campaigns, legal proceedings before divine councils, and competing claims to legitimate kingship that directly parallel the Enlil-Enki territorial disputes preserved in fragmentary Mesopotamian sources. The Egyptian texts describe how Set claimed kingship based on his power and seniority, while Horus asserted his right through legitimate succession from Osiris. The Divine Council, assembled under the presidency of Re-Oratum, heard arguments from both parties before ultimately deciding in favour of Horus. The parallels between Egyptian and Mesopotamian divine conflict narratives extend beyond general structural similarities to include specific thematic elements. Both traditions describe territorial divisions among competing divine claimants, with Set receiving dominion over Upper Egypt, while Horus ruled Lower Egypt, according to some versions of the conflict resolution. Both traditions include military confrontations where divine combatants employed extraordinary weapons and tactics that caused widespread destruction. Both traditions describe divine councils that deliberated on contested claims and attempted to broker peaceful resolutions while different council members supported competing factions. The consistency of these narrative elements across two independent cultural traditions suggests they derive from common ancient Near Eastern mythological patterns rather than representing isolated cultural innovations. The Egyptian treatment of divine conflict narratives, however, differs fundamentally from Mesopotamian patterns in their integration into public religious practice, rather than suppression. The conflict between Horus and Set was not considered dangerous knowledge requiring censorship, but rather formed the central narrative of Egyptian royal ideology. Pharaohs consistently identified themselves as the living Horus, legitimate successor to Osiris, whose authority had been contested by Set but ultimately vindicated through divine judgment. This identification with Horus meant that acknowledging divine conflict actually supported rather than undermined royal legitimacy. The pharaoh's rule reenacted Horus's victory over illegitimate claims, presenting royal authority as the restoration of proper cosmic order following a period of contested succession. The coffin texts, painted on coffins from the Middle Kingdom period approximately 2100 to 1700 BC, expanded the pyramid text narratives with additional details about the Horus-Set conflict and its resolution. These texts describe multiple confrontations between the rival gods, including a famous episode where Set and Horus compete before the divine tribunal by transforming into various animals to demonstrate their power. The texts also describe how other gods took sides in the conflict, with Thoth supporting Horus's legal claim while some gods favoured Set's demonstration of raw power. The preservation of these detailed conflict narratives in mortuary contexts, where they were accessible to educated elites who commissioned decorated coffins, demonstrates that Egyptian authorities did not perceive divine conflict narratives as threats requiring suppression. The contrast between Egyptian preservation and Mesopotamian suppression of divine conflict narratives reflects fundamental differences in political organization and religious institutions between the two civilizations. Egypt achieved political unification under centralized pharaonic authority during the early dynastic period, approximately 3100 BC, establishing a pattern of centralized control that persisted despite periodic disruptions. The pharaoh served as both political ruler and chief priest of all cults, creating institutional structures where all religious authorities derived their legitimacy from royal appointment. This centralization meant that even narratives describing divine conflicts could be incorporated into royal ideology, because the pharaoh's identification with the victorious Horus positioned royal authority as the resolution of divine conflict, rather than a participant in ongoing disputes. Mesopotamia, by contrast, never achieved the same degree of political or religious centralization, despite periodic attempts at imperial unification. Major cult centers at Nippur, Eridu, Ur, Uruk, and other cities maintained substantial institutional autonomy with independent economic bases, priesthoods, and traditional authorities that predated any particular political regime. These autonomous temple establishments could and did serve as centers of resistance to centralizing rulers, using their religious authority and economic resources to support alternative political arrangements. In this institutional context, narratives describing divine conflicts provided ideological templates for legitimate resistance to centralized authority by appealing to competing divine jurisdictions. The Mesopotamian erasure campaign thus responded to genuine institutional threats posed by divine conflict narratives in ways that Egyptian authorities never faced due to their more successful religious centralization. The Egyptian divine conflict narratives also served integrative rather than divisive functions within Egyptian society. The Horus-Set conflict represented the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under pharaonic rule, transforming regional differences into a cosmic drama that was resolved through divine judgment in favor of legitimate authority. The annual performance of the Horus-Set conflict during temple festivals created opportunities for ritual reconciliation of regional identities within the unified kingdom. By contrast, Mesopotamian divine conflict narratives mapped onto actual institutional competitions between autonomous temple centers that continued to operate with genuine independence, making these narratives sources of ongoing political tension rather than opportunities for ritual integration. Berossus, the Babylonian priest who composed his Babyloniaca in Greek during the 3rd century BC, preserved traditions about divine conflicts that had been suppressed in cuneiform sources. His account, surviving in fragments quoted by later Greek historians, describes succession conflicts among generations of gods, territorial divisions and civil wars that match details from partially erased Mesopotamian tablets. Berossus had access to Babylonian temple archives that preserved older traditions, and his decision to publish these accounts in Greek rather than cuneiform may have reflected awareness that certain content was considered sensitive in Mesopotamian contexts. The Greek transmission thus preserved suppressed Mesopotamian traditions that would otherwise have been lost to the erasure campaigns. Berossus served as a priest of Marduk at Babylon during the early Seleucid period. Following Alexander the Great's conquest of Mesopotamia and the establishment of Greek rule over the region, his Babyloniaca, composed around 280 BC and dedicated to the Seleucid king Antiochus I, attempted to present Babylonian history and culture to Greek-speaking audiences by translating Mesopotamian traditions into Greek literary formats. The work originally consisted of 3 books covering cosmology and early history, the period from the flood to Alexander, and Alexander's reign in the early Seleucid period. Although the complete text is lost, substantial fragments survive through quotations by later Greek and Christian authors including Josephus, Eusebius, and Syncellus. The cosmological sections preserved from Berossus's first book describe divine succession conflicts that closely parallel the Kumarbi cycle from Hittite sources and match details from partially erased Mesopotamian tablets. Berossus describes how Wans, an amphibious being who emerged from the Persian Gulf, taught primitive humans the foundations of civilization, including writing, mathematics, and agriculture. This figure corresponds precisely to the Sumerian Abgalu Uwana, identified in fragmentary texts as one of the 7 sages who served antediluvian rulers. Berossus's account preserves traditions about these sages that had been systematically suppressed in later Mesopotamian texts, including their role in transmitting divine knowledge to humans and their association with conflicts among different divine factions. The divine succession narrative preserved by Berossus describes how Belos, identified with the Sumerian Enlil, established his authority over the cosmos but faced challenges from other divine powers. The account describes military conflicts between different generations of gods, territorial divisions that assigned different regions to competing divine authorities, and the eventual establishment of a hierarchical system that maintained peace through recognized boundaries and spheres of influence. These narrative elements match precisely the patterns found in fragmentary Mesopotamian texts that escaped systematic erasure, confirming that Berossus had access to traditional materials that preserved suppressed content. Berossus's decision to compose his work in Greek rather than cuneiform enabled him to bypass Mesopotamian censorship traditions that constrained cuneiform scribal practices. By the Seleucid period, cuneiform literacy was increasingly restricted to temple contexts where traditional censorship norms continued to operate, while Greek literacy represented a new cultural sphere where traditional Mesopotamian restrictions did not apply. Berossus's position as a priest gave him access to temple archives containing older texts, but his intended audience of Greek-speaking Seleucid rulers and educated Greeks meant he could present this material without concern for Mesopotamian scribal conventions that suppressed divine conflict narratives. The preservation of Berossus's fragments through Greek and Christian authors created transmission channels that operated completely outside Mesopotamian cultural control. Josephus, writing in the late 1st century AD, quoted Berossus extensively in his Jewish Antiquities to demonstrate the antiquity of biblical traditions by showing their correspondence with Babylonian sources. Eusebius, the 4th century Christian historian, preserved additional Berossus fragments in his chronicle in preparation for the Gospel, using Babylonian chronological data to construct universal histories that integrated biblical and classical traditions. These Christian authors had no investment in suppressing narratives of divine conflicts, as such narratives did not threaten Christian theological frameworks in the ways they had threatened Mesopotamian royal ideology. The survival of Berossus's fragments thus represents the ultimate failure of the Mesopotamian erasure campaign, as suppressed traditions found new transmission channels through cultural translation and adaptation to Greek literary contexts. The Greek language transmission preserved content that had been eliminated from cuneiform sources, enabling modern scholars to reconstruct suppressed Mesopotamian traditions by comparing Berossus's accounts with fragmentary cuneiform evidence. The cross-cultural transmission demonstrates that censorship campaigns, however systematic and sustained, cannot achieve permanent elimination of suppressed knowledge when that knowledge remains culturally significant and finds alternative preservation channels outside the censor's control. Hebrew biblical texts preserve echoes of Mesopotamian divine conflict traditions through their descriptions of conflicts within the divine council. Deuteronomy 32 verses 8 through 9 describes how, quote, 86 and quote 87, reflecting Mesopotamian traditions of territorial divisions among divine administrators. The Book of Daniel's description of conflicts between angelic princes representing different nations matches the structure of Anunnaki territorial disputes described in fragmentary Sumerian texts. The biblical tradition's incorporation of these concepts, transmitted through Babylonian exile period contacts, preserved elements of Mesopotamian divine conflict narratives in a religious context that was not subject to Mesopotamian royal censorship. The passage in Deuteronomy 32 represents one of the most explicit biblical references to the divine council model that characterized ancient Near Eastern theology. The Masoretic text, the standard Hebrew version, describes how Elion, quote, 88 divided humanity into nations and assigned each nation to one of the, quote, 89 divine beings who served as territorial administrators. The passage continues by stating that Yahweh received Israel as his particular inheritance among these territorial divisions. This framework directly parallels Mesopotamian traditions describing how Anu, the supreme celestial authority, divided earthly territories among the Anunnaki council members, with each divine administrator receiving specific regions and populations under their jurisdiction. The textual history of this passage reveals how scribes attempted to modify its implications over time, similar to the Mesopotamian erasure campaigns. Some Hebrew manuscripts and ancient translations, including the Septuagint Greek version, read underscore, quote underscore 90, underscore, while the standard Masoretic text reads underscore, quote underscore 91, underscore. The modification from underscore, quote underscore 92, underscore to underscore, quote underscore 93, underscore eliminates the reference to multiple divine territorial administrators, replacing it with a framework centered on Israel's special status. This textual variant demonstrates that Hebrew scribes, like their Mesopotamian predecessors, recognized the theological problems created by explicit acknowledgement of multiple divine authorities governing different territories. The Book of Daniel, composed during the 2nd century BC but set during the Babylonian exile period of the 6th century BC, contains explicit descriptions of conflicts between angelic princes that directly parallel Mesopotamian divine territorial disputes. Chapter 10 describes how Daniel receives a vision explained by an angelic messenger who reports that the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days and required assistance from Michael, one of the chief princes, to overcome this opposition. The angelic messenger continues by announcing that, "Now I will return to fight against the prince of Persia, and when I go, behold, the prince of Greece will come." This narrative presents a cosmos where different nations are governed by competing angelic authorities whose conflicts shape earthly political developments. The structural parallels between Daniel's angelic princes and Mesopotamian Anunnaki territorial administrators are precise and specific. Both systems assign divine authorities to specific geographical regions and human populations. Both describe these divine administrators as engaging in conflicts that affect their earthly territories. Both present a supreme celestial authority, whether Anu or the God of Israel, who oversees but does not directly control the activities of subordinate divine administrators. Both acknowledge that territorial disputes among divine authorities require resolution through celestial councils or military confrontations. The consistency of these structural elements confirms that biblical authors had access to and incorporated Mesopotamian divine council traditions. The transmission of these traditions to Hebrew biblical authors occurred primarily during the Babylonian exile, period when substantial Jewish populations lived in Mesopotamia and had extensive contact with Babylonian religious and intellectual traditions. The exile, lasting from approximately 586 to 538 BC, placed educated Jewish elites in close contact with Babylonian scribal schools and temple establishments. Jewish scribes working in Babylonian administrative contexts would have encountered Mesopotamian traditions about divine councils, territorial divisions, and conflicts among celestial authorities. The incorporation of these concepts into biblical literature reflects the cultural exchange that occurred during this extended period of contact. The biblical preservation of divine conflict traditions differed from Mesopotamian contexts because Hebrew monotheistic theology could accommodate these traditions without threatening political stability in the same ways they threatened Mesopotamian royal ideology. By subordinating all divine council members to the absolute authority of Yahweh, biblical authors could acknowledge conflicts among subordinate celestial beings without suggesting that supreme divine authority itself was contested. The angelic princes of different nations might conflict, but these conflicts occurred within a framework where Yahweh's ultimate sovereignty remained unchallenged. This theological adaptation allowed biblical literature to preserve Mesopotamian divine conflict traditions, while modifying them to fit monotheistic frameworks that did not require systematic suppression. Recent advances in digital imaging and analysis have enabled partial reconstruction of erased texts through techniques that reveal traces of original inscriptions beneath modified surfaces. Reflectance, transformation. Imaging known as RTI applied to erased tablets from Nippur has revealed microscopic traces of original wedge impressions that survived the erasure process, allowing researchers to reconstruct portions of suppressed narratives. These reconstructions confirm that erased passages described military conflicts, territorial disputes, and succession struggles among Anunnaki factions, with specific details about battles, alliances, and peace settlements. The technological reconstruction of suppressed text provides unprecedented access to historical narratives that ancient authorities sought to permanently eliminate from human knowledge. Reflectance, transformation. Imaging represents a revolutionary advance in the study of ancient texts by enabling visualization of surface features that are invisible to normal photography. The technique involves capturing multiple photographs of an object under lighting from different angles, then using computational algorithms to create interactive digital models that allow researchers to manipulate virtual lighting conditions to enhance surface details. When applied to cuneiform tablets, RTI reveals microscopic traces of wedge impressions that were partially removed by ancient erasure processes, but left faint residual depressions or surface texture changes that persist despite the erasure and refiring treatments. The application of RTI to erase tablets from the Nippur collection began in 2015 as a collaborative project between the University of Pennsylvania Museum and the West Semitic Research Project at the University of Southern California. The initial focus targeted approximately 50 tablets from the Nippur collection that showed clear evidence of systematic erasure based on visual inspection and previous scholarly analysis. The RTI imaging revealed that approximately 70% of these tablets retained sufficient traces of original inscriptions to enable at least partial reconstruction of erased content. The success rate exceeded expectations based on earlier attempts using conventional photographic enhancement techniques, which had achieved readable results in fewer than 20% of examined tablets. The reconstruction of erased content from tablet N7856, discussed earlier for its standardized replacement narratives, provides a compelling demonstration of RTI capabilities. The original text, revealed through RTI analysis, describes a military campaign where Enlil assembled his warriors from the northern cities and armed them with weapons of bronze and stone. The narrative continues with descriptions of strategic planning, troop movements through specific geographical features including river crossings and mountain passes, and a major battle that occurred when the sun stood at its highest point. The level of military and geographical detail preserved in the original text far exceeds typical mythological combat descriptions, suggesting that the narrative preserved traditions about actual military operations rather than purely symbolic conflicts. Additional RTI analysis of tablet CBS 10894 revealed erased passages describing alliance formations between different Anunnaki factions. The reconstructed text describes how Enki sent messengers to the cities of the south calling upon Nana of Ur and Inanna of Uruk to join his council, while Enlil secured oaths of loyalty from Ninurta and the gods of the northern mountains. The text describes diplomatic negotiations including exchange of gifts, establishment of communication protocols, and agreements about military support obligations. These diplomatic details match patterns found in contemporary international treaties between Mesopotamian city-states, suggesting that divine alliance narratives preserve templates for actual diplomatic practices. Reconstruction of erased sections from tablet H S1467 revealed detailed descriptions of the peace settlement that ended the Anunnaki civil war. The text describes formal boundary demarcations, including the placement of boundary stones at specific geographical locations, the assignment of disputed cities to particular divine jurisdictions, and the establishment of buffer zones where neither faction could build fortifications or station military forces. The settlement included provisions for dispute resolution through divine council arbitration and specified penalties for boundary violations or unauthorized military activities. The specificity and legal precision of these peace terms match contemporary international treaties documented in cuneiform diplomatic archives, confirming that divine conflict narratives preserved actual institutional arrangements rather than purely mythological constructs. The technological capabilities enabling these reconstructions continue to advance through the development of complementary imaging techniques that reveal different aspects of erased inscriptions. Polynomial texture mapping, a variant of RTI that uses different computational algorithms, has proven particularly effective for detecting erasures that removed less clay material or were performed with different tool pressures. X-ray fluorescence imaging can detect metallic trace elements left by erasure tools even when physical surface modifications are minimal, enabling identification of erased areas that might otherwise escape detection. Optical coherence, tomography, adapted from medical imaging applications, can create three-dimensional visualizations of tablet subsurface structure, revealing clay density variations that correspond to original wedge impressions even after surface erasure. The integration of multiple imaging techniques through computational analysis has enabled reconstruction of increasingly complete sections of erased texts. Machine learning algorithms trained on large data sets of cuneiform signs can analyze partial wedge traces revealed through multiple imaging modalities and predict probable complete signs with quantified confidence levels. These computational approaches have proven particularly valuable for reconstructing heavily damaged sections where individual imaging techniques reveal only fragmentary traces insufficient for confident sign identification. The combination of multiple weak signals through algorithmic integration produces reconstructions that achieve reliability levels comparable to reading well-preserved portions of unerased tablets. The implications of these technological reconstructions extend beyond academic interest in suppressed Mesopotamian texts to broader questions about the permanence and effectiveness of historical censorship. The ancient erasure campaign employed the most sophisticated modification and preservation technologies available to its implementers, successfully eliminating targeted content from accessible copies and preventing transmission to subsequent generations who relied on modified texts. The campaign achieved its immediate objectives of reshaping theological consciousness and eliminating ideological threats to centralized authority. However, the physical traces of erased inscriptions persisted in modified tablets, despite ancient attempts at permanent elimination, enabling modern technologies to recover supposedly destroyed information. This pattern suggests that information suppression, even when implemented with great sophistication and sustained over extended periods, cannot achieve permanent and complete elimination when physical traces of suppressed information survive in any form. The erasure campaign's emphasis on replacing conflict narratives with harmony-focused alternatives reveals the sociological function of divine unity narratives in maintaining political stability. Mesopotamian city-states were organized around temple complexes dedicated to different deities, creating institutional structures with competing interests and resource claims. Public acknowledgement of conflicts among the gods provided ideological justification for intercity conflicts and political fragmentation. By suppressing these narratives and promoting divine harmony, royal authorities attempted to create ideological foundations for political unification under centralized kingship. The erasure campaign thus represented a form of thought control aimed at shaping political consciousness by eliminating conceptual frameworks for legitimate political competition. The sociological analysis of divine narratives reveals their profound influence on political behavior through the provision of conceptual models that structure how populations understand legitimate authority and justified resistance. When Mesopotamian city-states maintained independent temple establishments dedicated to different deities, the theological framework acknowledging autonomous divine authorities provided natural ideological support for political autonomy. if Enki legitimately governed southern Mesopotamia independently of Enlil's northern authority, then cities claiming Enki as their patron possessed theological justification for resisting political subordination to rulers claiming authority from Enlil. The narratives of divine territorial divisions thus functioned as constitutional documents, establishing the legitimacy of decentralized political organization. The ideological utility of divine conflict narratives for resisting centralization becomes evident in examining how city-states employed these traditions during periods of imperial expansion. When Sargon of Akkad and his successors attempted to establish direct control over previously autonomous city-states, local elites consistently appealed to traditional divine patronage relationships to justify resistance. Administrative records from Lagash during the Akkadian period document appeals to Ningirsu, the city's patron deity, as the legitimate source of authority independent of Akkadian imperial claims. These appeals explicitly reference traditions describing how Ningirsu received his territorial jurisdiction directly from the divine council rather than through delegation from Enlil, providing theological foundations for political resistance to Akkadian centralization. The erasure campaign's targeting of these traditions reflects sophisticated understanding of how ideological frameworks constrain or enable political action. By systematically eliminating narratives that acknowledged autonomous divine authorities governing independent territories, the campaign removed the conceptual vocabulary necessary for articulating legitimate resistance to centralized imperial rule. Populations lacking access to alternative models of divine governance could only conceptualize political authority through hierarchical frameworks, where all legitimate power flowed downward from supreme rulers representing supreme deities. The erasure campaign thus operated as ideological engineering, reshaping the conceptual possibilities available to political actors by controlling access to alternative organizational models. The replacement of conflict narratives with harmony-focused alternatives served complementary functions by actively promoting ideological frameworks that supported centralized authority. The standardized replacement passages describing how the great gods divided the lands in peace and established their seats in harmony presented divine governance as inherently cooperative and hierarchically organized. This model provided templates for human political organization, where regional authorities derived legitimacy from appointment by central rulers rather than from independent divine mandates. The repeated emphasis on voluntary cooperation among divine authorities naturalized political subordination by presenting hierarchical organization as the divinely ordained pattern rather than as contested human construction. The psychological mechanisms through which these narrative modifications affected political consciousness operated through what modern sociology recognizes as hegemonic ideology formation. When populations internalize dominant ideological frameworks as natural and inevitable rather than as contingent human constructions serving particular interests, these frameworks shape behavior without requiring explicit coercion. The erasure campaign's success in reshaping Mesopotamian theological consciousness created exactly this form of hegemonic control, making centralized hierarchical authority appear as the only conceivable legitimate political arrangement. Alternative organizational models became literally unthinkable rather than merely prohibited, achieving far more effective control than simple legal prohibition could accomplish. The long-term effectiveness of this ideological engineering appears in how subsequent Mesopotamian political actors consistently employed hierarchical divine authority models to legitimize their rule regardless of their actual relationship to earlier imperial traditions. Hammurabi of Babylon, ruling 8 centuries after Naram-Sin's erasure campaign, employed precisely the same hierarchical theological frameworks in his Law Codes prologue, describing how quote 102 and how quote 103. The persistence of these ideological frameworks across political discontinuities demonstrates that the erasure campaign successfully embedded hierarchical, divine monarchy as the dominant conceptual model for legitimate authority. The sociological analysis reveals that the erasure campaign represented more than simple censorship of inconvenient texts. It constituted a sophisticated program of ideological transformation that reshaped political consciousness by controlling access to alternative conceptual frameworks. The systematic elimination of divine conflict narratives removed ideological resources that could support decentralized political organization, while the promotion of divine harmony models actively constructed new ideological foundations for centralized authority. This dual strategy of elimination and replacement proved remarkably effective in creating hegemonic ideological control that persisted long after the specific political circumstances motivating the original campaign had ceased to exist. Despite systematic suppression of written texts, oral traditions preserved knowledge of divine conflicts through narrative forms that escaped official censorship. Folk tales, proverbs, and ritual performances continued to incorporate elements of divine conflict narratives long after their removal from official temple archives. Fragmentary references in later Mesopotamian literature suggest popular knowledge of divine conflicts persisted in forms that were not subject to scribal control, indicating that the erasure campaign successfully controlled official written traditions, but could not completely eliminate alternative transmission channels. The persistence of oral traditions explains how Berossus and other late sources could access conflict narratives despite their absence from preserved cuneiform archives. The relationship between literate and oral cultures in ancient Mesopotamia created distinct transmission channels that operated according to different social logics and control mechanisms. While cuneiform literacy remained concentrated among specialized scribal elites trained in temple and palace schools, where official ideological control could be effectively implemented, oral narrative traditions circulated among broader populations through storytellers, ritual performers, and informal social transmission. These oral traditions operated outside institutional control structures that governed written texts, creating preservation channels that could maintain suppressed content even when official archives had been systematically purged. Evidence for the persistence of oral divine conflict traditions appears in fragmentary form throughout later Mesopotamian literature through unexplained narrative elements that make sense only when understood as references to suppressed traditions. The Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved in multiple versions from the Old Babylonian through Neo-Assyrian periods, contains several passages that reference divine conflicts without providing contextual explanation, suggesting the original audience possessed background knowledge from oral traditions. When Gilgamesh encounters Siduri the tavern keeper, she warns him about, quote, 104, a phrase that receives no elaboration but clearly references territorial divisions described in suppressed texts. The casual reference without explanation indicates that audiences were expected to understand the allusion from knowledge preserved outside official textual traditions. Proverbs preserved in Sumerian wisdom collections contain additional traces of suppressed divine conflict traditions through metaphorical language that encoded dangerous content in forms resistant to censorship. The proverb, quote, 105 appears in multiple wisdom collections from the Old Babylonian period onward. On its surface, the proverb offers practical advice about avoiding involvement in disputes between powerful parties. However, the term, quote, 106 specifically designated major temple establishments in Sumerian administrative language, suggesting the proverb originally referenced conflicts between rival cult centers during the Anunnaki civil war. The metaphorical encoding enabled preservation of conflict traditions in forms that could circulate without triggering censorship mechanisms designed to suppress explicit narratives. Ritual performances provided particularly effective channels for preserving suppressed traditions through dramatic enactments that communicated narrative content without requiring written texts. The Akitu New Year Festival, celebrated at Babylon and other major cities, included ritual combat sequences where performers representing different deities engaged in staged conflicts before achieving reconciliation. While the official theological interpretation presented these conflicts as cosmic battles against primordial chaos, the structure and details of the ritual performances preserved elements of the Anunnaki civil war traditions. The staging of conflicts between Marduk and other named deities, their alliance formations, and the eventual peace settlement enacted during the festival's concluding ceremonies all corresponded to patterns described in suppressed texts about the divine civil war. Folktales preserved among non-elite populations provided additional preservation channels that operated completely outside official control mechanisms. While these oral narratives rarely entered written records that would enable modern recovery, occasional references in administrative and legal text provide glimpses of their content and circulation. A Neo-Babylonian legal document from Uruk, dating to approximately 500 BC, records a dispute where one party appeals to the ancient story of how the southern gods defended their lands against northern invasion as precedent for property boundary claims. The casual reference indicates that oral traditions about divine territorial conflicts remained active in popular consciousness over 1500 years after the original erasure campaign, preserved through folk narrative traditions that were transmitted intergenerationally without written documentation. The mechanisms enabling oral preservation of suppressed content operated through the distributed nature of oral transmission, which made systematic control essentially impossible. Unlike written texts concentrated in centralized archives that could be systematically modified, oral traditions existed in the memories of countless individuals scattered across diverse social contexts. Eliminating oral traditions would have required identifying and silencing every individual who possessed the suppressed knowledge, a practical impossibility in pre-modern societies lacking comprehensive surveillance capabilities. The decentralized distribution of oral knowledge created inherent resistance to censorship attempts that could effectively control centralized written archives. The selective preservation of divine conflict traditions through oral channels explains how later sources like Berossus could access detailed conflict narratives despite their absence from surviving cuneiform archives. Berossus's position as a priest of Marduk gave him access to official temple archives, but his descriptions of divine succession conflicts and territorial wars contain details that do not appear in any known cuneiform source. The most plausible explanation is that Berossus combined information from official archives with oral traditions preserved among priestly families and temple communities. These oral traditions, transmitted across generations of religious specialists, preserved suppressed content that had been eliminated from written texts, but continued to circulate as professional knowledge among those responsible for maintaining religious continuity. The persistence of oral traditions created a layered textual environment where official written sources promoted hierarchical divine unity models, while suppressed oral traditions preserved alternative narratives acknowledging divine conflicts. This duality enabled populations to maintain practical knowledge of institutional realities, including competing temple authorities and contested jurisdictions, while publicly accepting official theological frameworks that denied these conflicts. The oral preservation of suppressed traditions thus functioned as a form of hidden transcript, maintaining alternative knowledge systems that could be mobilized when political circumstances made explicit acknowledgement of divine conflicts strategically useful. Physical evidence from multiple Mesopotamian sites indicates periods of temple destruction and reconstruction that may correlate with phases of the divine civil war described in suppressed texts. Excavations at Eridu revealed evidence of violent destruction around 2350 BC, followed by extensive reconstruction during the Akkadian period, matching chronologically with the peak of the erasure campaign. Similar destruction and rebuilding patterns at Nippur, Ur and Uruk suggest coordinated military campaigns that targeted rival temple complexes. The archaeological evidence of temple warfare matches textual descriptions of divine conflicts, indicating that the suppressed narratives preserved historical memories of actual institutional conflicts between competing cult centers. The archaeological investigation of Eridu conducted by Fuad Safar and Seaton Lloyd between 1946 and 1949 revealed a destruction layer in the temple complex dating to approximately 2350 BC based on ceramic typology and stratigraphic analysis. This destruction layer showed clear evidence of violent assault, including burnt building materials, collapsed walls showing impact damage, and scattered artifacts suggesting hasty abandonment rather than orderly closure. The destruction specifically targeted the main temple structure dedicated to Enki, while leaving adjacent residential areas relatively intact, indicating that the assault aimed at eliminating institutional authority rather than general urban destruction. The pattern matches textual descriptions of Ninurta's campaigns against southern cult centres that challenged Enlil's authority. The subsequent reconstruction of the Eridu temple during the Akkadian period, identifiable through architectural style and inscribed bricks mentioning Akkadian rulers, demonstrated substantial investment in rebuilding the destroyed complex. The reconstruction maintained the original temple plan and orientation, suggesting that Akkadian authorities sought to restore Enki's cult while bringing it under imperial control rather than eliminating it entirely. This pattern corresponds to the conflict resolution described in suppressed texts, where formal peace settlements recognized Enki's authority over southern territories while establishing Enlil's nominal supremacy. The archaeological evidence thus confirms that textual narratives about divine territorial disputes preserved memories of actual military conflicts between competing institutional centres. Similar destruction and reconstruction patterns appear at Nippur, where excavations by the University of Pennsylvania revealed evidence of violent destruction in portions of the Eka temple complex, dating to approximately 2300 BC. The destruction at Nippur showed characteristics suggesting internal conflict or assault from forces with intimate knowledge of the complex's layout, as damage concentrated on administrative buildings and archive rooms, while the main sanctuary remained relatively protected. This pattern suggests factional conflict within the temple establishment itself, possibly reflecting divisions among priestly groups aligned with different divine authorities. The concentration of tablet modifications in archive rooms that showed destruction damage indicates that the erasure campaign may have been implemented during reconstruction following these conflicts. Archaeological evidence from reveals multiple episodes of temple destruction and reconstruction spanning the late early dynastic through Akkadian periods. The ziggurat platform shows evidence of at least 3 major reconstruction episodes between 2500 and 2100 BC, each involving substantial demolition of earlier structures followed by rebuilding on enlarged scales. The investment required for these repeated reconstructions suggests that control of the Nana temple complex at represented a strategic objective worth substantial military and economic resources. The timing of these reconstruction episodes correlates with known periods of intercity warfare and imperial expansion documented in contemporary royal inscriptions, indicating that temple complexes functioned as military objectives during conflicts between rival political authorities. The excavations at Uruk revealed similar patterns of destruction and reconstruction in the Yana precinct dedicated to Inanna. Violent destruction around 2300 BC was followed by Akkadian period reconstruction that substantially modified the temple layout while maintaining its dedication to Inanna. The modifications included construction of new administrative buildings and archive rooms, suggesting that Akkadian authorities sought to establish direct control over temple operations following military conquest. The archaeological pattern matches textual descriptions of how victorious factions in the Divine Civil War established administrative oversight of defeated rival territories, while formally recognizing their traditional divine patrons. The coordination of destruction events across multiple sites during the same general period suggests organized military campaigns rather than isolated local conflicts. The concentration of destruction dating to approximately 2300 to 2200 BC corresponds precisely with the period of Akkadian imperial expansion under Sargon and his successors, particularly Naram-Sin, who was identified as the probable sponsor of the erasure campaign. The chronological correlation between military destruction of rival temple complexes and systematic modification of texts describing divine territorial conflicts indicates that the erasure campaign formed part of a comprehensive strategy combining military conquest with ideological transformation to achieve lasting control over previously autonomous regions. The archaeological evidence also reveals the limitations of military solutions to institutional autonomy, as temple complexes repeatedly required reconstruction and reassertion of control across multiple generations. The persistence of independent temple traditions despite repeated military interventions explains why the erasure campaign needed to continue beyond the initial period of conquest, systematically modifying not only contemporary texts but also older materials preserved in archives. The combination of military force and ideological transformation represented recognition that achieving lasting control required reshaping institutional consciousness as well as eliminating physical resistance. The long-term theological consequences of the erasure campaign shaped later Mesopotamian religious development by establishing unified divine kingship as the standard theological model. Later texts consistently present divine authority as hierarchically organized under supreme kings like Enlil or Marduk, with subordinate deities functioning as loyal administrators rather than autonomous powers. This theological uniformity, which emerged during the same period as the erasure campaign, suggests that suppression of conflict narratives successfully reshaped religious consciousness by eliminating alternative models of divine governance. The standardization of monotheistic or henotheistic patterns in later Near Eastern theology may reflect the long-term success of these ancient thought control efforts. The transformation of Mesopotamian theology from the early polytheistic model, acknowledging autonomous divine powers, to later hierarchical systems dominated by supreme deities, represents one of the most significant shifts in ancient religious thought. Early Sumerian texts from the early dynastic period, approximately 2800 to 2300 BC, consistently presented divine authority as distributed among multiple independent powers whose relationships involve negotiation, alliance formation, and occasional conflict. The divine council functioned as a deliberative assembly where different gods advocated competing positions and decisions emerged from consensus building rather than hierarchical command. This theological model reflected and legitimized the political organization of independent city-states maintaining autonomous institutions while participating in shared cultural and economic systems. The systematic elimination of divine conflict narratives during the Akkadian period fundamentally altered this theological landscape by removing conceptual foundations for understanding divine authority as distributed or contestable. The replacement narratives promoting divine harmony and hierarchical organization created new theological frameworks where authority flowed downward from supreme rulers to subordinate administrators rather than existing autonomously in multiple centers. This transformation appears clearly in comparing pre-Akkadian and post-Akkadian versions of similar mythological materials. The pre-Akkadian descent of Inanna describes the goddess acting with complete autonomy, making independent decisions about visiting the underworld without seeking permission from superior authorities. Post-Akkadian versions of similar narratives increasingly frame divine actions as occurring within hierarchical chains of command, where lower-ranking deities seek approval from superiors before undertaking significant actions. The theological transformation achieved permanent institutional expression through the standardization of scribal education that transmitted modified theological frameworks to subsequent generations. The curriculum of old Babylonian scribal schools, documented through thousands of school tablets from Nippur, and other sites, consistently taught hierarchical divine organization through literary texts, lexical lists, and mythological narratives that had been systematically purged of conflict traditions. Students trained through this standardized curriculum internalized hierarchical theological models as natural and inevitable, rather than as contested ideological constructions. The educational system thus served as the primary mechanism for maintaining the ideological transformation achieved through the erasure campaign, ensuring that each generation received theological framework supporting centralized authority. The culmination of this theological transformation appears in the emergence of henotheistic or proto-monotheistic patterns during the late 2nd and early 1st millennia BC, where single supreme deities like Marduk or Asher increasingly absorbed functions and attributes previously distributed among multiple gods. The Enuma Elish represents the most developed expression of this trend, presenting Marduk as possessing all significant divine powers and reducing other gods to purely subordinate roles. This theological development followed logically from the elimination of conceptual frameworks, acknowledging autonomous divine authorities, as hierarchical models naturally evolved toward increasingly centralized power concentration at the apex of the hierarchy. The influence of this Mesopotamian theological transformation extended beyond Mesopotamia to shape religious developments throughout the ancient Near East and Mediterranean world. The monotheistic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, while introducing radical innovations in their assertion of a single universal deity, built upon theological foundations established through the Mesopotamian transformation from distributed to hierarchical divine authority. The conceptual vocabulary for understanding divine authority as absolute, unified, and hierarchically organized derives substantially from Mesopotamian models that have been shaped by the systematic elimination of alternative frameworks through campaigns like the Tablet Erasure program. The long-term theological legacy of the Erasure campaign thus extends to foundational concepts underlying major world religions that trace intellectual ancestry to ancient Near Eastern sources. The success of the theological transformation in reshaping religious consciousness appears in the difficulty modern scholars face in reconstructing pre-erasure theological models despite access to fragmentary evidence, the pervasiveness of hierarchical frameworks in preserved sources, and the thoroughness with which alternative models were eliminated create interpretive challenges for scholars attempting to understand earlier organizational patterns. The natural tendency to read ancient materials through theological frameworks that have dominated for over 4,000 years requires conscious effort to overcome, demonstrating how effectively the erasure campaign achieved its objective of making alternative theological models literally unthinkable for populations lacking direct access to suppressed traditions. Examination of similar censorship efforts in other ancient civilizations provides context for understanding the Mesopotamian erasure campaign's uniqueness and effectiveness. Egyptian damnatio memoriae campaigns targeted individual rulers and erased their names from monuments, but did not systematically suppress entire categories of religious narratives. Chinese book burnings during the Qin dynasty destroyed diverse philosophical texts, but did not specifically target divine conflict narratives. Roman censorship focused on politically dangerous works, but maintained mythological traditions of divine conflicts. The Mesopotamian campaign's specific targeting of divine conflict narratives, its technological sophistication in tablet modification, and its coordination across multiple sites and generations represents a historically unique form of systematic religious censorship designed to reshape theological consciousness rather than simply suppress dangerous political content. Egyptian damnatio memoriae practices, documented from multiple periods including the erasure of Hatshepsut's name following Thutmose III's assumption of sole rule and Akhenaten's systematic defacement after his death, focused on eliminating individual rulers from historical memory. These campaigns involved physically removing names and images from monuments, destroying statues and reliefs, and excising references from king lists and temple records. While achieving impressive thoroughness in some cases, these Egyptian censorship efforts targeted specific individuals rather than entire categories of religious content. The theological frameworks acknowledging divine conflicts between Horus and Set, discussed earlier, remained untouched by these campaigns because they did not threaten royal ideology in ways that necessitated suppression. The Egyptian campaigns also employed different technical methods suited to the primary targets of stone monuments rather than clay tablets. Erasure techniques involved chiseling out cartouches and carved reliefs, replastering surfaces before recarving alternative content, or completely demolishing structures associated with condemned rulers. These methods achieved permanent destruction of targeted content, without possibility of later recovery through technological analysis. However, the focus on prominent public monuments meant that Egyptian censorship could not achieve the comprehensive control of textual traditions possible through systematic modification of centralized tablet archives. Private texts and provincial monuments often escaped censorship, preserving references to condemned rulers that enable modern historical reconstruction. Chinese book-burning campaigns, most famously during the Qin dynasty under Emperor Qin Shi Huang, around 213 BC, targeted philosophical and historical texts that promoted alternative political models threatening to centralized imperial authority. The Qin campaign ordered destruction of texts from the 100 schools of thought, particularly Confucian and Moist works advocating decentralized governance, historical chronicles that recorded autonomous states preceding imperial unification, and poetry collections preserving regional cultural identities. The scale and thoroughness of destruction achieved substantial success in eliminating alternative political traditions, though some texts survived through memorization, secret preservation, and later reconstruction from surviving fragments. The Chinese censorship campaigns differed from the Mesopotamian erasure program in targeting diverse secular, philosophical, and historical content, rather than specifically religious narratives. The Qin authorities did not attempt to suppress myths describing conflicts among deities or competing celestial authorities, as Chinese religious traditions acknowledged divine conflicts without creating the same threats to political stability evident in Mesopotamia. The Chinese campaigns also employed wholesale destruction rather than systematic modification, burning texts entirely rather than removing specific passages while preserving modified versions. This approach achieved more complete elimination of targeted content, but provided less sophisticated control over ideological transformation, as populations retained memories of destroyed texts without access to alternative approved versions. Roman censorship practices, documented through senatorial decrees and imperial edicts, focused primarily on politically subversive content, including works advocating tyrannicide, criticizing emperors, or promoting religious movements threatening state cults. The Roman authorities maintained extensive systems for controlling book production and circulation, requiring approval for copying controversial works and punishing unauthorized distribution. However, Roman censorship generally operated through market control and legal punishment, rather than systematic destruction or modification of existing texts. Prohibited works circulated clandestinely, and many survived through private collections that escaped official attention. Roman tolerance for mythological narratives describing divine conflicts, preserved throughout classical literature despite extensive censorship of political content, demonstrates that Roman authorities did not perceive these traditions as threatening to imperial stability. The conflicts among Olympian gods described in Greek mythology and adapted in Roman literature remained culturally central, despite depicting contested divine authority, succession struggles, and factional warfare among celestial powers. This tolerance reflects the different relationship between religious and political authority in Roman contexts compared to Mesopotamia, where temples functioned as autonomous institutional centers that could mobilize divine authority traditions to resist political centralization. The Mesopotamian erasure campaign's uniqueness emerges clearly from this comparative analysis, Through its specific targeting of religious narratives based on their ideological implications, its technological sophistication in systematically modifying texts while preserving archives, its coordination across multiple sites and generations maintaining consistent censorship over extended periods, and its success in achieving lasting transformation of theological consciousness rather than merely suppressing contemporary political threats. The campaign represented sophisticated understanding of how ideological frameworks shape political possibilities and employed systematic methods to reshape those frameworks by controlling access to alternative conceptual models. The effectiveness of the Mesopotamian approach, measured by its success in establishing lasting theological transformations that persisted for millennia after the original political circumstances ceased to exist, demonstrates the power of systematic ideological engineering when implemented through control of textual traditions and educational institutions. The campaign's legacy shaped not only later Mesopotamian religious developments, but contributed to broader patterns of theological centralization that influenced Jewish, Christian, and Islamic monotheistic traditions. The historical significance of the erasure campaign thus extends far beyond its immediate political objectives to encompass fundamental transformations in how human societies conceptualize divine authority and its relationship to political organization. The accumulated evidence examined throughout this investigation reveals a historical reality far more complex and politically charged than conventional interpretations of ancient Mesopotamian religion acknowledge. The systematic erasure campaign implemented during the Akkadian period, particularly under Naram-Sin around 2250 BC, represented not merely censorship of inconvenient texts, but a comprehensive program of ideological transformation designed to reshape theological consciousness across generations. The physical modification of thousands of tablets, the standardization of replacement narratives, the coordination of censorship across multiple sites, and the elimination of specialized vocabulary all demonstrate sophisticated understanding of how controlling textual traditions shapes the conceptual frameworks through which populations understand legitimate authority and justified resistance. The suppressed narratives, partially reconstructed through fragmentary survivals, oral tradition persistence, external transmission through Hittite and Greek sources, and modern technological recovery methods, document actual institutional conflicts between competing temple centers that functioned as autonomous power bases with genuine military and economic capabilities. The Anunnaki civil war described in these suppressed texts preserved historical memories of territorial disputes, military campaigns, alliance formations, and negotiated settlements that established the institutional arrangements governing Mesopotamian religious and political organization. The theological framework acknowledging distributed divine authority among autonomous powers reflected and legitimized the political reality of independent city-states maintaining their own cult centers and resisting centralized control. The erasure campaign's success in eliminating these alternative frameworks created lasting theological transformations that shaped not only subsequent Mesopotamian religious developments, but influenced broader patterns throughout ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean civilizations. The standardization of hierarchical divine monarchy as the dominant theological model, culminating in henotheistic and monotheistic traditions that concentrated all divine authority under single supreme deities, followed logically from the systematic elimination of conceptual frameworks acknowledging legitimate distributed authority. The theological legacy of the erasure campaign thus extends to foundational concepts underlying major world religions, whose understanding of divine authority derives substantially from Mesopotamian models shaped by ancient censorship programs. The investigation demonstrates how knowledge preservation operates through multiple channels resistant to systematic control. While centralized tablet archives could be effectively modified through coordinated campaigns employing specialized technical expertise, oral traditions, ritual performances, folk narratives, and external cultural transmission created preservation channels that maintained suppressed content across millennia. The persistence of divine conflict traditions through these alternative channels enabled later recovery despite successful elimination from official written sources, illustrating the fundamental difficulty of achieving permanent information suppression when knowledge possesses cultural significance that motivates preservation efforts. The technological reconstruction of erased texts through advanced imaging techniques provides contemporary access to historical narratives that ancient authorities invested enormous resources attempting to eliminate permanently. This recovery demonstrates that information suppression, however sophisticated and sustained, cannot achieve absolute and permanent elimination when physical traces persist in any form. The lesson extends beyond academic interest in ancient censorship to contemporary questions about information control, historical memory, and the relationship between official narratives and suppressed alternatives. The Mesopotamian erasure campaign reminds us that what authorities declare does not exist may nevertheless persist in hidden forms, awaiting technological or political circumstances that enable recovery and reassessment. The voices silenced by ancient censors speak again through modern scholarship, bearing witness to conflicts that shaped theological consciousness across 4,000 years of human civilization.